Good morning and welcome to Sintra for the 5th ECB Forum on Central Banking. Last year, we focused on investment and growth in advanced economies. This year, we will continue to focus on advanced economies, covering the topic price and wage settings, and we look forward to rich and inspiring discussions over the next 2 days. Before I give the floor to President Draghi for his introductory speech, I would like to remind you all of our media policy. All sessions and panels during the forum will be webcast live. Therefore, they are on the record and can be reported upon live. All conversations with forum participants taking place on the sidelines of the forum and here on the ground are strictly off the record. For those of you interested in joining the social media conversation, we invite you to follow us on Twitter using the hashtag ECB Forum. And let me now give the floor to President Draghi for his introductory speech. President.
Well, good morning. Good morning, colleagues, dear participants. The euro area's economy continues on a growth path, and inflation is gradually returning towards our objective. But uncertainty permeates the economic outlook. Recent data releases have created questions about the durability of the growth outlook. And, as we will discuss over the next 2 days, the crisis has presented us with new issues and fresh challenges in understanding the wage and price setting process. Regarding the ECB's monetary policy, as outlined at last week's press conference, progress towards a sustained adjustment in inflation has been substantial so far. With longer-term inflation expectations well anchored, the underlying strength of the euro area economy and the continuing ample degree of monetary accommodation provide grounds to be confident that the sustained convergence of inflation towards our aim will continue in the period ahead and will be maintained even after a gradual winding down of our net asset purchases. But this requires monetary policy in the euro area to remain patient, persistent, and prudent. Let me review the recent economic developments. In 2017, growth in the euro area turned out stronger than we had anticipated. The annual growth rate in the fourth quarter was the fastest for a decade. But in 2018, growth has moderated and so far has come in below our expectations. In the latest Eurosystem staff projections, growth for 2018 has been revised down by 0.3 percentage points. This has prompted some questions about the sustainability of the ongoing expansion, which is unusual at such an early stage of the cycle. In historical terms, the current growth period is comparatively short in length and small in size. Since 1975, there have been 5 growth phases in the euro area. The average duration from trough to peak is 31 quarters, with GDP increasing by 21% over that period. The current expansion has to date lasted just 20 quarters, and GDP is less than 10% above the trough. To determine whether the moderation has any bearing on medium-term growth, we need to distinguish between its underlying drivers. In part, the moderation is related to supply-side factors. Some of these are temporary in nature and have already subsided, such as the cold winter weather in large parts of the euro area. There may also be broader supply factors at play. In particular, there are increasing signs that capacity constraints are starting to bind in some countries and sectors. Capacity utilization stands above its long-term average in euro area and in all large economies. The question is how much and how quickly firms will be able to increase supply to relieve these limits. Adjustment is already taking place in the labor market. The labor force participation rate in euro area has risen by 1.5 percentage points since the crisis and now stands at an all-time high. And businesses have been actively trying to expand capacity by increasing labor inputs. Employment has risen by 8.4 million since mid-2013 and is growing in nearly every euro area economy. This has indeed been a job-rich recovery. Compared with the previous growth phases going back to 1975, the contribution of labor to growth has been the highest on record, accounting for almost half of average annual growth. But the flip side of rising labor utilization has been the lack of capital deepening. Whereas capital deepening contributed at least 0.6 percentage points to annual growth in all those previous growth phases, its contribution to the current phase is approximately zero. This could explain why signs of capacity constraints are now emerging. Growth has largely been achieved by applying more labor to existing capital. Firms should increasingly turn to capital to lift capacity. And this is a process that has already begun as business investment has picked up and now stands above its pre-crisis level. Certainly, the conditions are in place to further foster investment, including improving profitability and supportive financial conditions. This is in line with the latest European Commission forecasts for potential output, which project an increase in the contribution from capital and a decrease from labor over the coming years. All this suggests that the supply-side factors we are currently seeing are likely to slowly unwind over the medium term. Where we need to pay closer attention in the nearer term is to developments on the demand side. By and large, the underlying fundamentals of the euro area remain solid. Domestic demand is robust, and the main motor of the expansion, the virtuous circle between employment and consumption, is still in place. External demand has been less positive, but this may partly reflect a pullback from the very strong export performance of last year, as well as temporary factors, as we all know, in our main trading partners. Yet, what is undeniable is that uncertainty surrounding the growth outlook has recently increased. The downside risks to the outlook come from three main sources: the threat of increased global protectionism, prompted by the imposition of steel and aluminum tariffs by the United States, rising oil prices triggered by geopolitical risks in the Middle East, and the possibility for persistent heightened financial market volatility. Set against this are some risks to the upside, stemming mainly from the fiscal expansion in the United States and more in the medium term from likely fiscal expansions in several countries in the euro area. We will continue to monitor these developments closely, but for now, our growth expectations for the medium term remain essentially unchanged, and we view the risks around that outlook as broadly balanced. For monetary policy, the key issue is how growth feeds into wages and then inflation. It is well known that the reaction of inflation dynamics to accelerating growth has been atypically slow in recent years. As I have discussed elsewhere, as a matter of fact here last year, there are a variety of factors that could explain this, ranging from mismeasurement of slack to a changing relationship between slack and wages. all this has injected quite some uncertainty into understanding and forecasting wage dynamics, which persists today. But there are signs that slack is now diminishing, and that the relationship between slack and wages is slowly reasserting itself. Different measures of slack, such as broad and headline unemployment, appear to give a similar picture of lessening spare capacity, although there is still high unemployment among specific groups and regions. In keeping with this, the unexplained residuals in the standard wage Phillips curve for the euro area are gradually reducing, and wage growth is beginning to pick up. Compensation per employee has lifted from its trough in mid-2016, is now growing at 1.9%. So far, the increase has been mainly explained by the wage drift component, which tends to react faster to cyclical improvements in the labor market. But annual growth in negotiated wages has already started to move upwards. Looking ahead, recent wage agreements, notably in Germany, but also in other large countries such as France and Spain, point to a continuation of these wage dynamics. There are signs that the restraint in public sector wage growth, which had in the past dragged on aggregate wage growth, is starting to relax. We are seeing an increase in domestic cost pressures along the pricing chain. Domestic producer price inflation for non-food consumer goods is growing at its highest rate since February 2013. Producer price inflation in the services sector, where wages represent around 40% of costs, also picked up. That said, higher wage growth doesn't mechanically translate into higher inflation. Even if wages continue to rise as we expect, we cannot exclude that structural factors beyond the central bank's control might hamper the transmission of wages into consumer prices. For example, more intense competition through globalization or e-commerce might act to compress margins. At present, we don't see much evidence that such factors have affected inflation in the euro area. What is key is that inflation expectations remain well anchored. Here, we are seeing some positive signs. For example, the latest ECB survey of professional forecasters shows longer-term inflation expectations stable at 1.9%. So, overall, there is growing evidence that broad-based economic growth is beginning to generate positive pricing dynamics, but uncertainty arising from economic developments lingers throughout the various stages of this process. So, what does this imply for our monetary policy? We have set out three conditions that must be in place for our net asset purchases to end. We need to see the convergence of inflation towards our aim over the medium term. We need to have sufficient confidence that this convergence will be realized, and the inflation path needs to show resilience and be self-sustaining without additional net purchases. Assessing these conditions is a forward-looking exercise because the full effects of monetary policy are felt only after long lags. We have to rely on our projections, the probability distributions surrounding them, and the extent to which they are dependent on our monetary policy actions. In terms of convergence, the latest projections see headline inflation reaching 1.7% in each of the next 3 years. Inflation, excluding food and energy, simple measure of underlying price pressures, is expected to climb to even higher levels over the same horizon. These are the latest in a series of projections which foresee inflation converging to our aim over a policy-relevant medium-term horizon. Importantly, over the course of the past year, that convergence path has held firm, and the timing of when we expect to attain our objective doesn't appear to have receded further into the future. Our confidence in the inflation path is also rising on the basis of two indicators we've been using to assess the probability of inflation convergence. The first is our own internal estimates of the distribution of future inflation outcomes. ECB staff have constructed a measure that combines the implied inflation distributions from a variety of sources: Eurosystem staff projections, model-based estimates, market-based measures of expectations, and surveys such as the SPF I mentioned before. These sources are then weighted by their historical ability to accurately forecast inflation. That aggregate probability distribution of 2-year-ahead inflation expectations has evolved in 3 dimensions that provide confidence that inflation adjustment is sustainable. The mean of the distribution has increased, the dispersion of the distribution has narrowed, and the downward skew has declined. Second, we've been monitoring a range of measures of underlying inflation, including model-based statistical measures, such as what we refer as the PCCI, and exclusion-based methods such as inflation excluding food and energy. Measures of underlying inflation typically provide some early information about the rate at which inflation will stabilize in the future once all the noise that is affecting current observed headline measures has faded away. Though underlying inflation hasn't yet shown a clear upward trend, the improvement in wage growth, domestic producer prices, and inflation expectations gives us more confidence that as resource utilization continues to tighten, underlying inflation will eventually begin to rise. Finally, market pricing provides some comfort on the resilience of inflation to the anticipated gradual ending of asset purchases. Inflation expectations are influenced not only by economic fundamentals and the cumulative impact of our past policies, but also by market expectations of future policy settings, including net asset purchases. Ahead of our meeting last week, the median market expectations for net purchases beyond September 2018 were small. It follows that the contribution to our inflation outlook from expected future net purchases was also modest. As a result of this assessment, last week, the Governing Council concluded that progress towards a sustained adjustment in inflation has been substantial so far. As we announced, we anticipate that after September 2018, subject to incoming data confirming our medium-term inflation outlook, we will reduce the monthly pace of the net asset purchases to 15 billion euro until the end of December this year, and then end net purchases. That decision, while acknowledging the increase in uncertainty, shows that we are confident that the projected convergence in the path of inflation will occur with sufficient probability without further net additions to our stimulus. The economy and the inflation process are developing at an underlying strength that was previously absent. As a result, I described here last year, monetary policy can accompany the economic recovery. But the projected convergence remains reliant on the substantial cumulative impact of past policies, which are locked into the supportive financial conditions present today. Significant monetary policy accommodation is still needed to support the further build-up of domestic price pressures and headline inflation developments over the medium term. Our latest unanimous decision ensures that the necessary monetary policy support remains in place. This support has a number of elements, including the net asset purchases until the end of the year, the sizable stock of acquired assets and the associated reinvestments, and our enhanced forward guidance on the key ECB interest rates. Our decisions also reflected the desire of the Governing Council to retain the ability to react to potential future shocks to ensure the sustained convergence of inflation to our medium-term aim. They embed precise elements of state contingency into our forward guidance. By clearly specifying and communicating our reaction function, we are able to act in a consistent and predictable fashion. Acting in this way helps reduce any market uncertainty that might arise concerning our future actions. Let me restate our recent decisions on our policy instruments. First, our anticipated ending of asset purchase in December this year is subject to incoming data, confirming the medium-term inflation outlook. Moreover, the APP can always be used in case contingencies materialize that we do not currently foresee. Second, we announced that we intend to maintain our policy of reinvesting the principal payments from maturing securities purchased under the asset purchase program for an extended time after the end of net purchases. And in any case, here is another element of optionality, and in any case, for as long as necessary to maintain favorable liquidity conditions and an ample degree of monetary accommodation. Third, we conveyed our expectation that the key ECB interest rates will remain at their present levels, at least through the summer of 2019, and again, optionality. In any case, for as long as necessary to ensure that the evolution of inflation remains aligned with our current expectations of a sustained adjustment path. This enhanced forward guidance clearly signals that we will remain patient in determining the timing of the first rate rise and will take a gradual approach to adjusting policy thereafter. The path of very short-term interest rates that is implicit in the term structure of today's money market interest rates broadly reflects these principles. As indicated at the ECB Watchers Conference earlier this year, after the end of net asset purchases, the main tool for shaping our policy stance will become the path of our key policy rates and the forward guidance about their likely evolution. Finally, we have stated that we stand ready to adjust all of our instruments as appropriate to ensure that inflation continues to move towards our medium-term aim of inflation below but close to 2%. Adjustments to our instruments will remain predictable, and they will proceed at a gradual pace that is most appropriate for inflation convergence to consolidate, taking into account continued uncertainty in the economy. In short, monetary policy in the euro area, and this will not surprise you, will remain patient, persistent, and prudent. Thank you.
Thank you, President Draghi. And now let me give a brief introduction to the Young Economist competition. I would like to draw your attention to the electronic posters displayed outside this conference room. They've been prepared by 11 young economists who were selected from a number of applications, actually 119, so quite a tough selection already. And as in previous years, the posters will be on display during the 2 days of the forum. Let me ask you to take a look at these posters, discuss them with the students, and then place your rating via the Forum's app. It is important because your rating is an essential part of the element for the jury to decide. I trust you have downloaded the app and using the instructions that you received before from the Forum, and if you have any issues with it, please do not hesitate to come and see us. The selection committee will evaluate the papers, and as I've said, take into account your rating, and the winner will be awarded a prize at the end of the conference tomorrow by President Draghi. Let's now watch a short video and listen to the students introducing themselves.
Ahoj.
Cześć.
Konnichiwa. Yasas.
Ni hao.
Hey, my name is Karin Shinnerud.
Jonathan Hazel.
Micha Mareczak.
No.
Delius.
Matteo. I'm 28 years old.
And I'm from Sweden. I'm interested in macroprudential policy and housing.
I study at the University of Oxford, and I'm interested in production networks.
And I'm from the United Kingdom. My research is in posted wage setting.
We are young economists.
And we will present our papers
At the ECB Forum on Central Banking.
Well, we are in Sintra, so please take some time. And I would now like to invite on stage Peter Praet, who will chair the session on macroeconomics of price and wage setting. And the discussion will then conclude with a Q&A session. And Peter, as always, I have to remind you, please be mindful of the time for each speaker. The floor is yours for Peter and everyone.
One. So we will start with first presentation by James, Slack and Cyclicality in Sensitive Inflation. So we have 25 minutes, and then Lucrezia, Discussant 15 minutes, and then we open the floor. So first session, please.
Thank you.
My role is to discipline you. There are plenty of slides, I tell you. So James.
Okay, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here, and it's a real honor to be able to speak right after President Draghi. It is also a bit of pressure on me to make sure that I set a good example in keeping to my time limits. So I will do I will try to do my best on this one. So I think the challenge of understanding inflation dynamics is particularly acute at the moment, given the tightening economies both in the United States and in the Euro area. The United States is, as you know, especially tight, with unemployment rate now at 3.8%, lowest since the 1970s. And yet, despite these very tight economic conditions, by a variety of measures, and indeed economic conditions that are facing additional fiscal stimulus, both as a result of the Tax Reform Act that was passed in December, and then the subsequent Omnibus Budget Reconciliation Act of January, we're facing quite a bit of additional fiscal stimulus in an already tight economy, yet what we've seen is that inflation is just going sideways. I'm going to focus on quarterly inflation, so my last data are from the first quarter of this year, and as everyone knows, there's been some slight uptick in the monthly numbers more recently, but there's also a lot of noise in those monthly numbers. So the challenge, and the picture actually is very similar in the Euro area as it is in the United States, where HICP, ex-energy and unprocessed food, which is the green line, has again been going roughly sideways despite the decline in the black line, the unemployment rate, since this recovery began. So the question is, what's going on here? And there are, of course, a lot of different possible theoretical explanations, and people point to anchored expectations and changes in monetary regimes and special factors and so forth. I'm going to go back to the basic theme of this conference and investigate two possibilities. First of all, one is just, are we measuring slack wrong? And so I'm going to take a closer look at different slack indexes. Here I'm going to focus on the United States simply because we have a longer data span, so we're able to get a little bit better resolution. The answer to that question is going to be no. I don't think that this is, there's not a magic slack measure out there waiting in the wings for us to use, and we just need to transition to using a different measure of slack. This is across the board. You can measure this in lots of different ways, and this flattening of the Phillips curve is real. It's really there. And so the next question is, well, what if we take a closer look? Take a closer look at components of inflation? Are there reasons to think that certain components of inflation might be more cyclically sensitive? That is there a slack or an economic activity relationship to changes of inflation that's present in certain measures but not in others? And this isn't something that we normally do. We normally look at an overall index or maybe strip out energy and food so that we can look at a less volatile index or measure of core. But I'd suggest that there's a fair amount of merit to looking at this, both a priori and then, as we shall see, by looking at it empirically. A priori, different prices are set in very different ways. So at one extreme, take global commodities such as unprocessed food or wheat or maize or oil, and those are set in global markets based on global economic conditions. And at the other extreme, think about food at a restaurant that you purchase here or purchase at any particular location. Those are local markets, and so there's not really much international. The costs are based on some basis of international trade, but the actual price that's going to be set and the markup that's going to be made is one that's going to be very sensitive or potentially sensitive to demand conditions. If you add on top of that, so we might expect different cyclical properties for different types of prices depending upon their exposure to international trade and other factors. If you add on top of that concerns about the quality of measurement of prices, then you can imagine that you could see a much stronger signal of cyclical activity in well-measured prices than in poorly measured prices. And so that's something that's going to be a part of the story too. And there are, and I'll talk about that again, mainly in the US. And now in the US, I don't get to hide just behind the data length. I will actually admit that I know much more about price measurement in the United States than I do in the Euro area. And so I would look to people here to extend some of those comments. Okay, so let me just give you one picture, and this is just the CBO unemployment gap. This is the Phillips relation, just a pure scatter plot, 4-quarter changes in 4-quarter inflation, plotted against a CBO unemployment gap. And the main picture, the main takeaway here is that the blue dots are from the 1960s and 70s, the orange gold is from the 80s and 90s, and the green is from the 2000s. And this is this flattening of the Phillips curve that is a chronic situation. We look at a variety of different slack measures. Gaps are incredibly difficult to measure. As we know, gaps change ex post as you get more data because we have a better estimate of what the underlying potential is or underlying NAIRU is. It's a challenging problem. So we look at a variety of different gap measures, some of them CBO gap measures in the Euro area. We'll look at the IMF and the EC gap measures. But some of them also are statistical techniques, using statistical techniques and smoothing. When we look across a variety of gap measures, you get different pictures. Here's what our gap measures look like in the United States. And you can see that there's different pictures for different gaps, but they give a broadly similar pattern, which is one that indicates that moves very cyclically, and one that especially indicates that we're in an increasingly tight environment right now. I'm going to put a table of numbers up, which is, I hope, yeah, this should be pretty visible. Okay, so these are, the first block of things are correlations, Phillips curve correlations, and this is 4-quarter changes in 4-quarter inflation compared to a particular slack measure. And then the second block is the slope of the Phillips curve. And the main thing to note as you scan across this is if you look across the first three numbers, you'll see this decline in the correlation between this Phillips curve correlation between the unemployment gap and the four-quarter change in PCE inflation from minus 0.52 to minus 0.48 to minus 0.11 over these three episodes. And that is the main message of this table, and then I'll flip some things on the next one, is that goes across the board. Just changing a slack measure isn't going to change that answer. If I go down and I use other things, capacity utilization or employment population ratios or other measures, short-term unemployment rates, you see the same flattening of this Phillips curve. You can look at lots of different gap indexes, ones that we haven't reported here, and you get the same picture. So there's not a magic bullet out there in terms of using some other slack measure. Sure, they give different pictures of the current circumstances, but the flattening of the Phillips curve is something that's really there. So then the question that we then investigate is whether or not you can learn more by digging into the details of the components of inflation. And there's really two separate and distinct messages here, and this slide relates to one of them. One of the messages is that not all components, not all price measurements are created equal. Some are really pretty well measured, quite well, I would argue, quite well measured prices and quite well measured rates of inflation, whereas others are really quite poorly measured or even just purely imputed, so not measured at all. So at the one end, and here I'm focusing on the United States, on the one end we have what we've done is we've grouped the different price components, the 17 components of PCE inflation, into three different categories of well-measured, okay, and not so great. And the well-measured ones include things like housing, excluding utilities. So housing is measured not on housing prices. For those of you who aren't familiar with the US system, we don't measure housing prices. We actually measure rents, and then we use those rents either for the rental units to represent the actual rental stock or to impute an owner's equivalent rent for owned homes. But they're all based off of actual market rents, and they're based off of market rents at the same unit. So a unit is surveyed, and then someone goes back 6 months later and remeasures it. And if there's if they've painted it or if they've rehabbed it or put in a new stove, then they're going to upgrade that and build that into the costs. But this is really very comparable. It's the same good. It's the same apartment in the same location, and they're getting the actual rent that's really paid. So these are well measured. The new goods problem is handled in a very sensible way. If you get a new stove put in, then you get a new stove put in. Other measures are really quite well done, and they aren't just goods. A lot of these are services. So there's the services from housing, recreational services. Some of these are very well measured objects. Some of them on the other extreme are extremely poorly measured objects. So financial services is a large chunk of financial services are actually there are no market prices for example, convenience services provided by banks to consumers. So those are based on imputed prices, based on interest foregone on some potential alternative asset or alternative investment. That requires a lot of judgment, and it imputes some challenges, some major challenges. My favorite here, which is actually part of our consumption basket, is not part of HICP, but it's part of per final consumption is nonprofit institutions serving households. So for example, that's the price index there is the price of religious services. So if you go to a church, you don't have to pay for that, but it's a service provided for you and it's part of final consumption. What's the price of that? And of course there's no price. So this is a completely made up object. So what we do is we are going to compare that to some various slack measures, and we're going to try to look at the cyclical properties of these different components. The slack measures we use, and I suspect our discussant will talk about this, the slack measures we use were actually bandpassed. So we're going to look at the business cycle frequency. So we take industrial production and GDP and a number of other series, pass them through a time series filter so that we're looking at their fluctuations between 6 and 32 quarters, and then we use that as our slack measure. That actually induces somewhat different behavior than gaps, and I'm going to come back to that. Here's 4 different components. So food services and accommodations. Remember, these are restaurants. So this is food, not food off premises or unprocessed food. This is food at restaurants, and this is hotels. And the blue line is our slack measure, and the black line is the 4-quarter change in 4-quarter inflation. And you can actually see that there's a reasonable amount of co-movement between food services and accommodations and our slack measure. The correlation's about 0.46. Correlation of about 0.48 with rents. So rents are cyclically sensitive if you have hot economic times, and if you're anyone who's gone to San Francisco and tries to rent in San Francisco knows that rents are really darn high, that it's a very desirable place to be. So that's a local market that's subject to demand pressures, and you'll see that, and you actually see that in rents as well. On the other extreme, you have goods or services, in this case, like healthcare services. To a large extent, those are negotiated or managed or administered prices in the United States. They're mainly not prices that are directly paid for by consumers. Plus, there's an awful lot of difficulty of measuring what those prices actually are because of the difficulty of measuring a quantity or a unit of consumption in healthcare. That correlation actually happens to be negative, minus 0.11, but we'll just call that 0. Clothing and footwear is an interesting one to keep in mind. It's a well-measured, the prices themselves are well-measured. They're really prices at stores or online. The problem is the new goods problem with clothing and footwear is really substantial. And there's always, there's improvements, and of course the improvements are like this shirt gets out of fashion and then some other shirt that's exactly like it is introduced at a higher price, and how do you handle that? And then that's a real mess. And I think the people who construct that are well aware of that. And so what you find is a very low correlation, but that could just be a measurement problem, or it could be some international trade issues. So if you look across these different series, components, you can see wide variation in the correlation structure. So ranging from 0.48 for housing excluding gas and electric utilities all the way into negative signs. Here's a little factoid. Motor vehicles and parts actually seems to have a strong negative cyclical correlation. That seems really strange. How could the correlation actually be backwards for motor vehicles and parts? Why is there an upside down Phillips curve? And it turns out there's just one observation there, which is a program during the Recovery Act called Cash for Clunkers, and that occurred at the depths of the recession, and it completely changed motor vehicle prices in 1 quarter. So don't trust that series. So what we're going to do is we're going to combine these together, and we're going to say which of these, if we look at weighted averages, which of these which comes in with weights, and we're going to construct an index, and we'll call that index cyclically sensitive inflation, and we're going to use a regression to figure out what these weights actually are. You can tech this up and do it in lots of different ways, but the basic message of the simplest regression approach gives an answer here. Say when we look at the weights. The final column here is now the weights that we get in this regression on our CSI index, where we're going to be weighting these up to be giving a cyclical signal. And most of the weight goes on housing. Some of the weight goes on foods and beverages off premises. So that's restaurants. I'm sorry, that's at grocery stores. Some of it is on recreational services. Some is on food services and accommodations. A really interesting side note is we had gone a priori just based on conversations with experts and learning about how the quality of measurement. Almost all of the weight in this index goes on the well-measured series. So the poorly measured series get almost no weight, which is an interesting side observation that really suggests that these measurement problems could be potentially important, especially when we think underlying changes of inflation are small now. This is our index. The black line is our cyclically sensitive index, and you can see that at least more recently, in certain instances, we have stronger cyclical behavior. So if you look before the 2001, right around the turn of the century, you'll see that there was a sharp rise in CSI inflation prior to the financial bubble recession. You'll see that there was a rise in CSI inflation coming into the 2007 recession, a sharp drop in it coming out of the recession. It's been rising slightly. Core PCE, which is the red line, has been roughly flat for the last 3 years. The CSI index has been rising ever so slightly by about 0.5 or 0.6 percentage points over the last 3 years, but it's a very modest increase. Certainly nothing like the increases that we've seen prior to previous recessions or previous periods of overheating. Let me turn to, so this is a table on the Phillips, on these Phillips relations, and although these gaps were not used in actually estimating it, what's really striking about this table is that a lot of these Phillips correlations and Phillips curve slopes have remained stable or strong over the course of this, over the course of the last 20 years, whereas that was not the case with PCE, ex-food and energy. Let me turn to the euro area. So I'm going to conclude by looking at the euro area measures of slack. And we look at a variety of different measures of slack there. We look at the IMF output gap, the EC unemployment gap, and then we use 3 bandpass series, all for the euro area, 19 countries. And those are output series. And the data set is shorter, of course, than for the United States, so we do our estimation starting in 1996. I want to thank the ECB staff for helping us sort out some data issues. They were extremely helpful. So let's take a look at some of these same components. So now it's a little, the ECB, the Eurostat structure is a little different than, is quite different than the US structure. The US structure goes along the goods and services dichotomy. The Eurostat structure tends to go along whatever hedonic uses, I guess, is one way to think about it, or of looking at it from the perspective of consumer basket, consumer areas rather than through a goods and services breakdown. So these things are not at all, they're not directly comparable in terms of their components, but we still can take a look. So it turns out that restaurants, so again, restaurants, food at restaurants seems to be strongly cyclical in the euro area. Housing and rents are not at all, so that's quite different than in the United States. Healthcare is just like the United States, which it seems to have a very small cyclical component. Clothing and footwear is like in the United States. It seems to be very noisy and also not with much of a cyclical component. So when we look across the different series, you see some of them, furnishing, household items, and maintenance has a high cyclical component. Food and non-alcoholic beverages has a high cyclical component. Restaurants and hotels has a high cyclical component. When we estimate the CSI weights, a fair amount of it actually goes on furnishings, households, and maintenance. This is a combination of goods and services, so it includes furnishings like sofas and rugs and that sort of thing. It also includes some household maintenance items, repairs, domestic services, and a really interesting question is digging underneath this and trying to understand what's driving this correlation, whether it's coming from the goods sides or the services sides, where you would think there'd be fairly different dynamics. We have not done that, and I think that's an interesting next step. This is our index of CSI inflation for the euro area. It's the black line. Unlike in so the most striking feature of this is in the US, our index of CSI inflation was rather different than PCE core. It shows an uptick now. It showed different properties around the 2000 recession. It showed different properties around the 2007 recession. In contrast, in the euro area, at least over the last 8 or 10 years, our CSI index looks a lot like PCE ex food and unprocessed, ex energy and unprocessed food. That's not true over the entire historical period, but that certainly is true recently. And that I don't really have any explanation for that other than just saying that's how the numbers worked out. And it's a little bit curious because the weights we're putting on the components are really quite different than the consumption share weights that the HICP ex food and energy is putting on the components. So why that? I think there's no particular reason why that needs to be, and it's kind of a curious feature that it is. If you look at what's going on at the very end of this series, over the last year or so, these two indexes, again, looking at through Q1 of this year, have been roughly flat. So they're showing very little indication of a pickup of prices. So let me just summarize. What we've done is one thing I think we're pretty confident of is that just trying to find a magic slack measure that's not the right way to go. I think there's a lot of information in these components. The components really have a wide range of measurement qualities. It's intriguing that in the US, when you look at the cyclical sensitivity, that the cyclical sensitivity is the most for the best measured series. There is an issue in terms of what the dependent variable here might be. One possibility, which we've done, is to look at these bandpass series, the cyclical measures based on activity. A different one is to look at gaps. Gaps have pluses and minuses. What we did is we did an exercise both for the United States and for the Euro area, and we said, well, what if we use, on the left-hand side, we use all three. We use an output gap, and we use an unemployment gap, and we use our bandpass cyclical indicator, and we let the data choose the weights. So that's something you could, if you want to be technical, you can call that a constrained canonical correlation analysis. And the weights that it chose, it put almost all the weights on the bandpass series, which was quite surprising to us. We thought that the gap measures would come in and say something, and the gap measures didn't really come in. So it sort of says that these cyclically sensitive inflation series want to be correlated with these cyclical measures based on these bandpass indexes. In any event, what we're seeing on a substantive level right now is basically quiescence over the last year, that both in the Euro area and in the United States, these measures, like the core measures, have been pretty stable and are not indicating any particular uptick. What one takes away from that for monetary policy is certainly there's no particular reason right now to press the panic button. Rather, this seems to be a situation where we're making slow progress towards an inflation that's closer to our targets, or could possibly be commensurate with that sort of thing. I do want to stress that the actual level of this CSI inflation measure doesn't really, because it has these different weights on these components, you can't really interpret the level of the inflation measure because it excludes other things that would enter a market basket, but you can interpret the changes, and for now it seems to be fairly stable and certainly doesn't look anything like what we saw going into the 2000 and 2007 recessions.
Thank you. Thank you. That was perfect. Thank you, James. So, Lucrezia, your remarks? There are many questions, James, that will come later. But I was a bit struck by the fact that you had put all your accent on one indicator, which is CSI. There are many others, as you know. It was a bit, but that's for the discussion later.
Okay. I think my presentation will come, hopefully. Okay, good. So good morning. It's a pleasure to be here, Sintra, this year again. And I think that Jim and I must be putting a good show, because this is the third time in a year and a half that I'm discussing a Stock and Watson paper, so at a policy conference. And it's a pleasure to do so. So what is this paper about? This paper actually, it's about looking for the Phillips curve. Jim has said it is the wrong way to go to look for a magic component reflecting the Phillips curve. But at the end of the story, identifying a CSI, this cyclically sensitive index, is more or less aiming at the same objective. And the issue is that it has been very difficult for empirical people like us to extract such a cyclical component from raw data. And so from that, the usual question is the Phillips curve flattening, has it disappearing, or simply is it lost in noisy data? And I think the answer that Jim provides is it is actually lost in noisy data. Actually, the answer is to the question of whether the Phillips curve has disappeared or just is lost in noisy data and can be found, it is very important for policy reasons, of course. It is a very difficult empirical problem because, as you know, inflation is dominated by trends, which are actually influenced by expectations and monetary policy. So what we are looking for is really a tiny component of inflation, which is what is left. Okay? And part of it is measurement, and part maybe is cyclical. Another difficulty is that one empirical fact about inflation is that, and this is the empirical fact that Jim is emphasizing, is that when you look at disaggregated prices, there is very little correlation across component of inflation. There is much smaller correlation across component of inflation than there is, for example, across conjunctural real indicators. And this actually, so I think I have very much sympathies with your approach, which is try to exploit this heterogeneity in order to extract something cyclical. So the message of my discussion is that I like the approach, as I said. And actually, I also agree with the author's conclusion, which actually there is such a thing which is cyclical. So there is such a thing that which is like reflecting the Phillips curve. So the Phillips curve is not dead. Okay, you can rephrase that conclusion in that way. I will, quarrel on some, technical details on how robust is this particular indicator, and then I will provide another model on my own in order to, read the results, through the lens of another model, which I would use as a benchmark. So 3 parts: close look at the CSI, my alternative decomposition, and then I will spend in the third part some time just looking at where are we now and what are the data telling us about the Phillips curve in the US and in the euro area. So some facts about the cyclical sensitive indicator, so the indicator that Jim and Mark have extracted. So this is basically housing, okay? So you see it here. This in red, you have the CSI. In blue, you have what I call the core PCE housing, which is actually the housing variable that they have used in the paper. So I think it's basically that's what it is, okay, when you look at it in delta. And you see that there are situations in which the core PCE housing is actually quite, this is picking up. This is, before the crisis, this is actually the housing boom in the US. And, overall, although it's not very visible in rate of differences, it will be much more visible in levels. You can see that housing tends to be a bit higher than the CSI. Now, if you look at their table with their indexes, of course, what you see is that housing has about 63% of weight in the index, while it's only 23% in PCE. The second most important variable is food and beverage, and then everything else is more or less zero. So how do we interpret this index? This is basically an index about housing. It is cyclical, but it's a very small component of PCE, which, then we have to ask the question, how can we use it, in policies, given the fact that it's such a small component. Now, if you look at why this is the case, why the index pick up housing, I think you have to look at the correlation between housing and what they call the CAI, the cyclical activity indicator, which is this kind of bandpass, smoothed version of various real variables, unemployment, GDP, and so on. So indeed, you can see a lot of correlation in housing. This actually would be the difference with, which you don't find in European data, because this is actually mostly rent, while we have a different definition in the HICP in the euro area. So then the question is, okay, there is this correlation, but then let's look at the CAI, so the indicator of slack, and plot it against the CBO, the Congressional Budget Office output gap, to see what are the differences in order to understand what does regression that picks up the weights actually picks. So you see that actually the CI is not exactly the output gap, as Jim emphasized, and it has some weird, I would call them weird characteristics. For example, it has a peak here. I don't know exactly what that is. And actually, from 2012, it indicates a weakening of cyclical conditions in the US, which it seems to me a little bit counterintuitive. So given this kind of this kind of smooth but volatile component in CAI, then I wonder whether when you do the correlation, you are capturing something which is not actually business cycle, but maybe some component of the housing dynamic which reflects something else, probably a part of an asset price cycles, since housing is also correlated with asset prices. Now, this is actually more visible when you do it in level. You can see here you have the CSI, so their indicator. Here you have the core PCE, and in blue you have the PCE. So you see that the CSI, it is higher. Okay, so Jim is saying we should not interpret the level, but the level is just a reflection that also when you see it in first difference is, it indicates, it's a bit shifted up. So this is when you accumulate back, you can see this shift. And you can see that now this is flat in the last part of the sample and well above the PCE. So the question here I would have for Jim is, are you really picking up just the cycle, or are you picking up a slow-moving component which is specific to housing and possibly correlated with housing prices? So basically, how should we interpret the higher level of the CSI with respect to the core PCE? Jim says we shouldn't care about it. Does this reflect asset prices? And then the third question is why, in the last part of the sample, this indicator is actually flat, although there is a lot of evidence that actually the recovery in the US has gained strength in the last few years. Now, the fourth question is, okay, let's say that we find a disconnection between the PCE and the CSI. How should we really interpret it, and in particular, how should we use it? So if for many years, so we have seen that the CSI is a very small component of PCE. So if the CSI is signaling a cyclical strengthening, but this does not reflect in headline, so what? Okay, so how should the policymaker, use this thing in policy decision? So in order to try to provide a tentative answer to these questions, I'm going to produce another model. Okay, so let's now stop for a minute because this is another model, and I will have to spend some time discussing it. So this is an alternative approach which, in principle, should deliver the same results at the CSI. So instead of pre-massaging the data, I am going to put everything in the same box, real variables and inflation variables. I'm not going to look at all these different indicators of inflation, but I'm just going to look at oil and headline inflation, in my case, the CPI. Because I think that understanding oil, it will give you a lot of mileage in understanding also the cyclical part. And, okay, so I will tell the model, so I will do everything jointly without pre-massaging, so to avoid this kind of quarrels about what kind of measure of output gap you should use and so on. Okay, so the model will filter. I will just identify by saying, please give me a cycle which is stationary, okay? Because, I mean, if a cycle has to have some characteristic, it will have to be stationary, okay? So there will have to be reversion to the mean. And the rest is trend, and the cycle I will split it in two parts, a part reflecting the real variables, which is the common component from the real variable, between the real variable and the nominal variables. So in a way, it's like a CSI, okay? So it kind of captures the maximum correlation between the real and the nominal variable of that stationary component. But I would also tell the model to give me to kind of identify an orthogonal part, which is just energy. It's that part of energy that does not go through the Phillips curve. I will call the Phillips curve cycle the common component between unemployment rate, GDP, inflation expectation, and inflation. I will identify the trend through inflation expectations. But I mean, today I would just want to concentrate on the cycle. So here are my results. This is the output gap, is the common component in real GDP. This is just the cycle part of my result. This is the output gap common component between prices and real variables in GDP. So you see has the, I will return to that. I will show you a picture of how it compares to the CBO. The yellow part that you see here in unemployment is an idiosyncratic element, because we know that unemployment and GDP, they have lag-lead relations. So when you kind of averaging them out, you don't exactly get the same. You're averaging variables which are lagging and leading, so have different dynamic characteristics. But I really want to focus just on CPI. The blue here is what I call the Phillips curve component, which would be similar in principle to the CSI. This is a very smooth component. It is actually a cycle which has a duration of about 8 years, so that corresponds to our notion of the business cycle. The red is oil. So there is a very large component of oil, which is actually orthogonal to real variables, probably influenced by expectation or by global economic slack rather than local economic slack. And then you have some yellow here, which is just measurement error. Now, let me just zoom from 2008 in order to understand why this decomposition is actually important. You see that this is the crisis. You have the blue, the Phillips curve is pushing prices back, and also oil is pushing them back. But actually, from 2011, oil is pushing them up, while the Phillips curve is pushing them down. So this is actually the missing disinflation. Why did you have a missing disinflation? Because oil was working in the opposite direction of the Phillips curve, okay, of the real slack, of the slack economic conditions. As you go up, as you move on, you see that now oil is moving again in the opposite direction, but pushing prices down, while the US economy is recovering. And actually here, my output gap is quite different from Jim's, because he's telling us that we have had a steady reinforcement of business cycle conditions since 2014, 2015. So here, this is the missing inflation. The missing inflation is because oil is clouding out the Phillips curve component. So this is basically the importance of getting rid of oil, okay? So for the euro area, you get very similar results. But again, where I differ here from Jim is that at the end of the sample, I have actually, according, in line with what Mario Draghi just said, that I think that the European recovery is getting steam. And actually, this is the forecasting period in dashed lines. You can see that the Phillips curve component for prices has still a little bit to go. Okay, so it's not neutral, but there are pressure for this tiny cyclical component of inflation, and will put prices up. And I'll show you the forecast in a minute. So let's compare it now. This is our output gap as it comes out from that model. The data, are doing the model is doing the extraction. Is quite similar in shape with the CBO. Our is this green here. I don't want to emphasize which one. Of course, we are all massaging the data, so I'm not pushing. I'm not saying mine is better or not, but I'm just saying, what is this thing here in the CI of their paper? Okay, so I think that we, from the 90s to 2001, we had a steady recovery. This is what the output gap measures. The CI picks this thing, which then feeds the CSI, the cyclical thing. And then what is this thing here that we have picked according to the CI earlier on, and now actually, the index is pushing the cycle down. Now, in terms of now the comparison between my Phillips curve component, the blue, and their CSI, there is quite a lot of correlation, as there should be, but at some point, okay, the correlation, actually the level is shifted up. Okay, so that you can see, because we're very similar to core, so you can see the same chart that you have seen before. And actually, you can see that here, while we are we are indicating that cyclical pressure and inflation are going up, they are quite flat. Okay, so there is another component, but I think I'm running out of time, so that you see here there is a little bit of a difference between the CSI and housing. This is housing. And actually, if I had more time, I would show you that this is all related to energy. So that actually, this is the second component which is weighted in Jim's indicator, which is food. But food has an indirect effect on energy, and when you correlate it with energy, you see that the indicator is they correlates with housing whenever energy goes up. Okay, so let me. This is for the euro area instead. Okay, we are much more correlated with Jim and Mark's indicator, and this is just because the housing in the euro area is a different type of variable, is flat, is not cyclical, and so we are at that point we are very correlated, which indicates that housing is really what matters. Okay, so that and probably there is a cycle of housing which is not entirely correlated with the business cycle. Now, does it matter? Okay, let's see. After all, this is all about a lot of massaging. But if this matters, this cyclical pressure that from Jim's index or from our index should translate at some point on headline inflation. Okay, so this is how these things should be, possibly used. So now, where are we now today? The U.S., the CSI is saying positive cyclical pressure for inflation, more or less constant since 2012. While the trend cycle model says upward pressure for 2015, which has now peaked. Okay, so our model will tell us that now if there is no more fiscal expansion or other external shocks or oil development, mechanically, our model will bring inflation gradually down because the U.S. cycle has peaked. For the euro area, well, Jim says neutral pressure. We say upward pressure since 2007, gradually building up, not having peaked yet. So that's the forecast. For CPI inflation for the U.S., okay, so this is, we are actually saying this has peaked and it's going to go down gradually, so we are much lower than the OECD and the IMF forecast. This, of course, there is a lot of uncertainty around that picture. Consider that these are tiny movements because actual inflation is dominated by trend, okay? So that this for good things because, possibly inflation expectations are anchored. Okay, so this is the HICP, and we are actually having quite a different pictures. I mean, there is a gradual building up, and here we are very much similar to the institutional forecast. So here we have updated this. We started the forecasting in the first quarter of 2018. So, similar in spirit, but quite different results empirically, especially for the last part of the sample where we should focus on. So conclusion, some doubts about the model specification. However, I agree with the paper, fundamental conclusion. There is a cyclical component of inflation hidden in the data. This indicates that the Phillips curve is alive and well, but it has to be found. And, it is like finding a needle in a haystack, but it's there somewhere, okay? So go and look for it. Thank you.
Are we doing thematic discussion now?
Apparently not. Shall we take a few questions now because I think that the second presentation is a bit different. So I think maybe you want James to react to especially the last graph that we had, this inflation outlook from Lucrezia compared to what you had. I think it would be useful to have a little exchange on this now.
Mine will work. Okay, excellent. Okay, so I guess the first thing is thanks so much, Lucrezia. I look forward to being a discussant for one of your papers in the near future. Yeah, so that it would be great to react to those forecasts. We actually intentionally didn't try to take this to the forecasting stage. I think it's still early. One thing, let me just stress one thing though. I think it's possible to take issues with a lot of the particulars of what we would have done. The one thing, if there is a takeaway from here, one thing I want to stress is I think there's a lot of interesting information in these components. There's also a lot of non-information in some of the components, and stripping away those problems and taking them seriously and modeling them seriously, I think, is a really important thing to do. I know some of that work is actually already ongoing here at the ECB. It's not just a matter of constructing the indexes, but it's a matter of using our tools to analyze those components and to extract this cyclical information. I think what I'd rather do than respond to Lucrezia's excellent comments is just get some comments from the questions if we have some time.
Pick up one. I had one question. I mean, James, I mean, not taking the room, but why do you come only with that indicator, one indicator? We have a battery of indicators at the ECB. You know, one based on a dynamic factor model when you try to see the underlying trends, you know, in inflation, and not, you know, basically Phillips curve sort of reasoning. So we have a number one. So I was a bit surprised that you only focused on that one. You have others just here for this presentation? You decided that? Or?
Oh, no, I think that the goal here is a very simple one, which is if you go and look at the components, do you see an indication of Phillips curve type behavior? Then we decided we would try to put that together into a single indicator. But I think just going and looking at what's happening with food and accommodations, that's really an interesting index. What's happening with housing in the United States, I really would say that it's not as... The way that most models of housing go is that the fundamentals are based on rents, and then that drives what the fundamental price of housings would be, and then whether you have a housing bubble is usually measured by how far away asset prices are from the rents underlying, and the rents are driven by local economic conditions. So I think that that's actually the way it's measured is getting at something of economic interest.
I have Ben, you want to give name and affiliations because.
I'm Ben Friedman, also from Harvard. Jim, I think it would be interesting for you to say something about how you see the central bank taking advantage of what you found.
Yeah.
And the reason I ask that is that it strikes me there are two quite opposite interpretations. You mentioned two reasons for thinking a priori that different components of the price index would behave differently over cyclical frequencies. And although you mentioned them together, they have very different implications for how the central bank might use what you found. You mentioned on the one hand that some of them are badly measured. You gave examples. And if that's what's going on, then a plausible inference is for the central bank to target even the index that you constructed on the notion that if those components that you flag are moving forward rapidly or not, then it's plausible to believe that many other prices are moving forward or not also, but we just don't observe it because they're not measured well. Right. And the implication is that the central bank should target that index. And by contrast, you mentioned the difference between prices of goods and services that are subject to local within-country cyclical pressures versus those that are not. And if that's what's going on, then the central bank shouldn't target it, because then if your index is showing say, above 2% inflation, there's no reason to think that other prices are showing above 2% inflation. It's not a measurement issue. It's just that they're set very differently. And so the fact that the CSI is, say, moving forward at 3% might be informative and might help forecast, but it certainly doesn't represent any reason to believe that prices as a whole are unstable on the central bank's definition. So could you say something about how you, just without downplaying any of the considerations Lucrezia mentioned, could you say how you would, even if everything that you said we take at face value, how would you use it?
Yeah, quick.
Okay, so I'm going to give the very short answer is in the current circumstance, we have 3.8% unemployment in the United States, and based on the historical evidence, if you go back and you think about it over a long period of time when we've had unemployment rates that have been this low, there's been nascent inflation. Is that something that we see today, or is it not? So this is the way I'm looking at this, this is a way to hone in on see whether we're seeing nascent inflation in areas where we might expect it. We don't at the moment see that, and that's an interesting finding that tells me that we are not in a position where we need to step on the brakes quite yet.
President Draghi mentioned longer lags, and Lucrezia mentioned trends. I mean, these are really serious issues. I'm worried that the accelerationist view that you've taken of inflation is misleading. If one thinks of inflation, relative price developments, adjustment to relative prices is part of the inflation process. And Dennis Sargan, back in 1964, wrote this great paper using those ideas in order to understand the inflation process. I think the accelerationist view has at least two problems. One is that demand curves slope down. So if a firm raises prices too much, there's a tendency for prices then to correct downwards. Mm-hmm. And the other one is that central banks, after all, are here and are focused on dampening inflation. So when you have a year of high inflation, the central bank then intervenes, and that's followed by lower inflation. So that's the opposite of the accelerationist view. We've done some empirical work, Janine, Aaron, and I, in which we find for the US that once you allow some of these long-run effects to enter the equation, a year of high inflation tends to be followed by lower inflation. So that's the opposite of the accelerationist view. So I really think that these long-run view of inflation needs to be treated more seriously. And one other point. I think in 2008, 2009, the world economy suffered something like a heart attack. Now that's a structural break. You mentioned the cash for clunkers, for example, as one example of a really weird price development during that period. So one way of thinking of it is to say, well, let's see whether after that structural break, things are back to normal. So instead of treating the period as a whole and trying to explain what happened, you might try to take out the period of the crisis and let's say, look at the model up to 2008 and then from 2012 onwards and see whether with that window taken out, we're back to a more normal set of relationships.
If you estimate, one of the exercises we did was re-estimate the model just through 2007, and you get basically the same weights. So for what it's worth, it's basically the same index and very similar cyclical patterns.
I confirm. Also in my model, it's very stable.
Question there. Name and affiliation, I think, so that's.
Frank Smets, ECB. I was wondering about whether you've looked into nonlinearities. I know that in the past you've sort of demonstrated, at least for the US, that the Phillips curve emerges in sort of deep recessions and is quite dormant in boom periods. Yeah. And I was wondering whether there could also be nonlinearities in boom periods, that as the output gap closes, actually the Phillips curve steepens again and sort of price pressures emerge.
Yeah, so we didn't do that in this exercise, and Frank's referring to our Jackson Hole 2010 paper, and I think that certainly is sitting in the background, and that's another reason for being concerned about the lags in the current circumstance.
Did you? Hello. I'm Joe Hazel from MIT. Did you look at excluding the Volcker recession, so in the early 1980s? So it seems to me, if you look at a lot of the evidence, that post-1984, going into the 1990s, the Phillips curve is very flat, and in some sense, the surprising episode is the early 1980s, not the subsequent period. And I was wondering if that affected your calculations.
Well, I mean, certainly there's this enormous change in monetary policy post-Volcker, so that we would expect structural shifts, and indeed, whatever you look at, there's a roughly speaking great moderation, 1984, Volcker recession, whatever you want to call it, a structural break around that period of time. So we've just entirely focused on the post-1984 episode.
Jim Bullard, St. Louis Fed. So just two comments echoing some of the previous comments. It seems like there's a fundamental problem if you go to subcomponents of the price index, because when one price goes up, you'd expect people to substitute away and move toward other goods. And so it seems like that would present bias in your results. So I'm not sure if religious services are going up or down when these other prices are moving, and you'd like to be able to. So I'm wondering what the bias is for that. And then the other part is that there are really clear trend components in the sub indices, medical inflation, and especially tech prices, but many others. And I'm wondering what you're doing. Are you saying that there are different trends with the bandpass filter, or are you imposing a common trend, or what are you doing with that?
Bandpass filter pulls out the low frequency trends in each of them, so it treats them as, it's agnostic. It just treats all those trends as different. So it doesn't impose any common trend. But you're absolutely right that that's actually a big deal. If you analyze these components, that's difficult. I guess in terms of substitution, sure. If we think about the ultimate effect on prices in a market basket, you have to take into account the substitution. We'll have more discussion about that. But it also, if you're just going back to this sort of overheating pressure, is there the overheating pressure that's visible? I think that we can view this as an indicator, instead of thinking about it in terms of ultimate consumer basket prices.
Other questions? I mean, still the point of Lucrezia on asset prices, and the link, the U.S. weight in housing. I mean, it's.
I just don't think that
in your presentation. I think it's really something.
But I just don't think that's I don't think that's the right interpretation here, because the U.S. it is rents, and the rents are driven by various supply and demand considerations. Now, you could have criticized this. The rents are driven by both supply and demand. So if there's increased housing construction, then that's going to be something that's going to.
But okay, so related to that, and yes, and this question, I mean, there is an idiosyncratic trend that you can see in the levels.
Yes.
And so that's why you are higher than PCE for most of the sample, and actually since the 90s, so that you're picking up not only the cyclical thing, but also that kind of smoother component, which is that part of housing which is related to asset prices. Okay, I think that's something is going on, because the level, I mean, you have to interpret that thing. So it has to be commensurable to inflation. You're consistently high.
It doesn't have to be related to asset prices. It has to. I mean, we've had a lot of, over the last 20 years or 30 years, the story of housing in the United States is one of local zoning restrictions and inadequate supply, and so people are spending more and more of their incomes on housing.
There is an idiosyncratic trend, anyway.
Yeah.
In Europe, there has been a big disconnect between asset prices, housing, and rents. So I was not surprised by the low weight that you have in your indicator.
Yeah, interesting.
Yeah. So other comments, questions? Okay, if not, we're almost through. So Yuriy, so there are two parts. I like the provocative part that you have about expectation as an instrument. So please.
All right, thanks for putting this paper on the program. It's a great pleasure to be here. This is joint work with Olivier Coibion, who is also here, Saten, Kumar, and Mathieu Pedemonte. Now, why is this a good time to talk about inflation expectations as a policy tool? I thought Larry Summers set the stage perfectly for us. We know that a key variable for many economic decisions, consumption, investment, pricing, employment, is the real interest rate. And by moving this object around, we can decelerate or accelerate the economy, and so we can achieve macroeconomic stabilization. And the way we typically do this in terms of monetary policy is to anchor inflation expectations at some level, say 2%, and then we're going to move around the nominal interest rate, which is going to translate into changes in the real interest rate. And so this is going to accelerate or decelerate the economy, and this is how we stabilize. Now, if the nominal interest rate is stuck at the zero lower bound, we cannot do this policy anymore, right? We have to use something unconventional. But it doesn't mean like in this set of circumstances, we're completely powerless. We can still have some power to move the real interest rate. So if the nominal interest rate is zero, we can still move around the nominal interest, the inflation expectations, which are going to translate into changes in the real interest rate. And so again, we can accelerate, decelerate the economy, we can stabilize it. Mario Draghi, a few years ago, had a very simple summary of how this works. When inflation expectations go up with zero nominal interest rates, real rates go down. When real rates go down, investments and economic activity improves. That's the reasoning. Okay, that was in response to a question from a journalist. Now, we can elaborate on this summary and describe, various channels of how this inflation expectations are going to work. For example, by raising inflation expectations, we can stimulate households to consume more. We can induce firms to invest more. We can induce firms to raise their prices. Workers demand higher wages. All of the good things that we need to happen at the zero lower bound to stimulate the economy. So it seems like conceptually it's a very straightforward exercise. And we should use inflation expectations as a policy tool. But before we do this, before we make this a conventional tool, we should answer some practical questions. The first question is going to be whose expectations we should target, right? And obviously, we should care about financial markets, professional forecasters, but the channels I described in the previous slides are really about households and firms. And so one answer we provide in this paper to this question is that we should really care about households and firms if we want to make inflation expectations a successful tool. Now, if it's households and firms, the next question is, what forces influence expectations of these agents? What moves them around? And the basic conclusion we get in this paper is that salient prices of frequently purchased goods, gasoline, food, in some countries exchange rate, are the key determinants of inflation expectations. Now, this presents challenges and opportunities. For example, central banks cannot run networks of gas stations, supermarkets to control these prices. So it would be really unconventional monetary policy. But we have some opportunities there as well. In principle, we can just engage in communication strategies and try to talk people into changing their inflation expectations. And the question is this going to work? We review available evidence based on a variety of sources, and our answer to this question is yes. You can communicate to households useful information. They're going to behave like Bayesians. They have some priors. You give them signals. They update their beliefs. And you can be very effective in moving their inflation expectations. Now, suppose you're successful in moving inflation expectations, okay? You change beliefs. Then the next question is, are people going to act upon these expectations? Right? That's the key question because, some people think that survey measures of inflation expectations are pure noise. They don't matter for anything, for consumption, for investment, for employment, for pricing. Again, we review available evidence. I'll show you some details in a bit. And the answer to this question is yes. The survey measures of expectations are useful. People act upon this information. There are some details to be ironed out, but the basic conclusions is people act on these expectations. All right, so far the logical chain is very clear. We have all ingredients in place, but there are some challenges in using inflation expectations as a tool. I'll describe this in more detail later, but basically we identified two issues. One is we have to have much better measures of inflation expectations if we want to use this as a tool. That's one. And second, I will argue that consumers and firms don't really pay a lot of attention to monetary policy in low inflation environments. And so if we want to move inflation expectations, if we want to convince people that they should consume more, they should invest more, we have to penetrate through, I say here, a veil of inattention. It's really a wall of inattention. It's really hard to reach to those people. Now, in the rest of this talk, I'm going to elaborate on each of those points and try to convince you that our conclusions here actually make sense. So the first question, whose expectations we should measure. This is the time series of inflation expectations in the US for professional forecasters and financial markets. You see they're very, very highly correlated. Sometime in the 2000s, they stabilized at 2%, and so this is what we used to argue that central banks were successful at anchoring inflation expectations. Now, when you look at households, this is the time series of inflation expectations in the Michigan survey of consumers. You see that in the early part of the sample, the correlation between inflation expectations of households and professional forecasters was very, very high. But sometime in 2000s, we start to see big differences. We see wedges, and sometimes those differences are very big as 2 percentage points. Right, so it's not clear that inflation expectations are very much anchored in the US for households. And so we can't really use inflation expectations of professional forecasters and financial markets as a substitute for expectations of households. Now, one key question here is where firms are going to be in the spectrum. It's conceivable they're like professional forecasters, they pay a lot of attention to what happens with inflation, what monetary policy says, or they may be like consumers. For this paper, we ran a spatial survey on a national representative sample of firms in the US. And we found that the average expected inflation in the US for CEOs and CFOs in the sample was 3.7 percentage points, which is very close to what happens with households. They're very far from professional forecasters and financial markets. So if we care about managing expectations of households and firms, we cannot rely on measures of expectations from professional forecasters and from financial markets. Now, when we see these differences, the key question is then, what moves these expectations? Why do we see these differences? We review available evidence and basically group these forces into 4 bins. The first bin is perceptions and experiences of inflation. Basically, if I oversimplify the available evidence, I would say that if I think inflation was 5% in the previous over the last 12 months, I'm going to think inflation is going to be 5% in the next 12 months. That's kind of the basic result in this literature. Now, this is a sort of a backward-looking force. There is a forward-looking force, shopping. It offers us natural opportunities to observe prices and update our beliefs about inflation. And to give you a sense of how powerful this force is, this figure here shows you time series of inflation expectations in the Michigan Survey of Consumers, the blue line. And the black line is the price of gasoline in the US at the monthly frequency. Now, I know, I guess all of us know, that it's impossible to prove anything beyond reasonable doubt in macroeconomics. But when you see this kind of correlation, you start to wonder if you have a shot at proving something. For example, we typically think that high-frequency variation in inflation expectations in the Michigan Survey of Consumers is just pure noise. But here, this figure is telling you that this, short-term fluctuations are actually very highly correlated with the changes in the price of gasoline. All right, so there is a very strong correlation, and there is something similar for Europe. Now, we can also obviously get information from media, and we may be affected by policy. When we review the relative strengths of those forces, we basically conclude that shopping and perceptions are very strong forces, and policy is a very weak force. And I'll give you some examples in a bit. Okay. Now, so if households are really influenced by their shopping experience, what is the option for central banks to influence their inflation expectations? One option is just talk to those people and try to convince them that inflation should be such and such number. Can we manipulate expectations in this way? Right, that's a key question. And to answer this question, typically this literature relies on randomized controlled trials, which means you elicit expectations, you get a sense about priors people have, then you have an informational treatment. For example, you tell them about the inflation target, okay? And then you're going to measure their expectations again, and you see how much they revise their beliefs. The 2 basic results from this literature is that economic agents, households, and firms are Bayesian learners. They have priors, they have signals. Depending on the relative strengths of these 2 forces, they come up with posterior beliefs. That's the first result. The second result is that these informational interventions are very short-lived. Basically, within 6 months, people forget what you tell them. Okay, so it's probably not surprising. They're very busy. Now, to give you a sense of how much you can move inflation expectations, Olivier, Coibion, me, and Michael Weber, who is going to speak here tomorrow, ran a spatial experiment on households participating in the AC Nielsen HomeScan panel. The experiment is very similar to what I described, just in a bit. Basically, we have a control group, and then we have various treatment groups. One of the treatment groups was told that past inflation is such and such number, and then we see what was the treatment effect of that, how much people revised their beliefs. And we see that the average treatment effect here is minus 2 percentage points. That is, you roughly start with 4% inflation expectations, you move them back to 2%. That's roughly the magnitude. We can also tell people about the target of the Fed, again, a very powerful revision in inflation expectations. We can also tell them about FOMC inflation forecast, again, a big revision in their inflation expectations. So you can move inflation expectations by talking to people. Now, as I said, the next question is, how do we know that consumers and firms are going to use this information for their decisions, consumption, investment, employment, and pricing? That's a huge identification challenge because we don't know what people know, right? We don't know what they do because of something, okay? The way to get causal estimates is to rely on natural experiments or randomized controlled trials. The design of these randomized controlled trials is similar to what I showed you before, except that you have an extra lag when you measure not just expectations, but also actual outcomes. Prices that are charged by firms, or employment that was made by firms, or consumption spending that was done by households. Okay. Now, what is the sort of summary of this literature that uses randomized controlled trials and natural experiments? For consumers, there is some variation in the results. But the basic conclusion here is that if you can convince households that inflation is going to be high in the future, they're going to spend more today. Okay. For firms, it's a little bit more nuanced. When we did this experiment in New Zealand, we see that if we convince firms that inflation is going to be high in the future, they're going to hire more people, do more investment, and have no effect on prices. When we do something similar in Italy using a quasi-experimental design, we see that moving inflation expectations up generates higher prices, so firms want to charge higher prices, but at the same time they want to lower their employment and lower their investment. It's kind of move in the opposite direction. Now, why we have these differences between Italy and New Zealand is an active area of very active research for us, but it tells us that these treatment effects are not necessarily invariant. They depend on circumstances. For example, in Italy we have a ZLB, and New Zealand we didn't have a ZLB. Maybe this is one of the reasons why we have this differential responses. For France, we don't have randomized variation, but we have very long time series of matched inflation expectations and price changes. And there we see a very strong correlation between inflation expectations and prices. If a firm believes inflation is going to be high, it's very likely this firm is going to raise its prices. Okay. Now, what conclusions we can have from this literature? First is that households and firms act upon their reported inflation expectations. So this is not just noise. That's good news. Also, we know that manipulating inflation expectations can give us a new channel to influence inflation. That is, if we can convince firms that inflation is going to be high in the future, they will start moving prices now. Okay, and that's a new channel for monetary policy. Now, as I told you, this is still a relatively young literature, and we have some details to iron out. But, for example, we need to understand beta mechanisms and general equilibrium effects. But conceptually, all the evidence I have presented to you now suggests that we can use inflation expectations in principle. We can move inflation expectations. People are going to act upon those expectations. We can have a new stabilization tool. Now, before we do this, as I said, we have to address some challenges. And one is going to be measurement of inflation expectations. For households, we have reasonably good measures of inflation expectations, even though we found it surprising that many central banks do not have their own inflation expectations. They have to rely on somebody else to do these expectations. For example, in the US, for a long time, it was the Michigan Survey of Consumers. There was nothing run by the Fed. Now there is a survey run by the Fed. The ECB doesn't have its own survey of inflation expectations of households. For firms, the situation is a lot worse. Okay, in the paper, we have a long list of complaints, what is not quite right with this surveys. Let me give you some examples. The surveys tend to be based on small non-representative samples, and if you want to manage the aggregate economy, you can't rely on 50 firms to say, okay, this is what we're going to do in terms of monetary policy, spend billions and trillions of dollars or euros trying to achieve something. Another one, which is really problematic, is that many of the surveys have qualitative questions. Would prices go up? Prices would go down? Would prices stay the same? Again, if you want to use inflation expectations as a tool, you have to have a lot more precision and granularity in these responses. You can't just rely on up and down. You can use balances. Another common problem there is priming of responses. Basically, you nudge respondents to give you an answer you would like to see. I'm kind of exaggerating this, but this is roughly an idea. For example, Bank of Canada has this business outlook survey, which is a multiple choice question where you have 4 possible responses. Inflation will be less than 1%, 1 to 2, 2 to 3, more than 3. Okay, so it gives you a very narrow range. And obviously, firms, when look at this, they pick something in the middle, 2%, and so you claim then that inflation expectations are stable. You can give them one option, 2%, yes, no. For some surveys, it's not really about aggregate outcomes. For example, Atlanta Fed survey has questions about firm-specific unit costs. And we ran a series of experiments in New Zealand to explore whether it's a problem to ask firms about their specific outcomes or about their aggregate outcomes. We found that these macro expectations have very different properties. They are basically uncorrelated. And so if we want to measure inflation expectations, we should not rely on firm-specific prices, expectations about firm-specific prices or firm-specific unit costs. Now, surveys of firms are expensive. You have to penetrate through layers of secretaries and various filters before you reach out to CEOs and CFOs, especially when you talk to big firms. They are expensive, but they're also extremely useful. And maybe not surprisingly, some of the best surveys are run by countries which had recent histories of high inflation, Uruguay and Ukraine. You know, if Ukraine, I'm from Ukraine. If Ukraine can do it, I think any advanced economy can do the same, if not better. All right, so that was the first challenge. The second challenge is breaking through this whale of inattention. All right, to give you a sense of how problematic this inattention is, again, we ran a special survey of firms and households in the US and asked them to report their perceptions of the inflation target in the US. What's the target of the Fed? Now, you know, you look at this and we were very surprised. Roughly 20-25% of firms and households in the US gave us the right answer. Roughly 50% said, you know, they don't know or gave us a nonsensical number. Right? So that was shocking. And if we want to manage inflation expectations, it's not going to work if we have something like this. Now, this is not just about, you know, steady state perceptions about targets. We can all look at sort of high frequency evidence of inflation expectations. This vertical line shows the time when the Fed made an announcement that it's going to have a permanent 2% inflation target. And the, I guess, roughly horizontal line is the time series of inflation expectations in the Michigan Survey of Consumers. Again, it's 1 year ahead. You know, before the announcement, households thought inflation is going to be 4%. After the announcement, they saw it's going to be 4%. You know, we look at the financial markets and professional forecasters. We see big movements there. For households, the treatment effect was 0. They just didn't know what's going on. Now, this is not about, you know, the Fed or, you know, inflation expectations. You can look at other countries, other measures of expectations. For example, this figure here shows employment expectations in European countries around the time when ECB made an important announcement. And again, you see very little action here. Now, this may suggest to you that, okay, this is a mission impossible. We can't influence those people, and they're just, you know, hopeless. But that would be a wrong conclusion. We know public campaigns work very well for other policies, for fiscal policy, for healthcare policy. We can influence expectations of people. We can change their choices. We also have solid experimental evidence telling us that if we can somehow reach people, give them useful information, they're going to revise their beliefs and they're going to act upon these beliefs. So it's doable. The question is how we should, you know, design our messages in such a way that we can penetrate through this wall of inattention. And here we have some practical advice. Again, as a part of this experiment, we did two things. We asked people to read the FOMC statement, and you know, various estimates suggest that to fully understand the statement, you should have 18 years of education. This is just, you know, regular people in AC Nielsen panel. Anyway, so some of them read it. It generated big revisions in inflation expectations down, okay? But the size of the revision is comparable to what these people will do if they just have one sentence summarizing inflation expectations, you know, a forecast from the FOMC. So you don't have to have complicated messages. You can just have, you know, one sentence summary and tell them, you know, this is what's going to happen. It's going to have the same effect on inflation expectations. Another implication from our analysis is that we know information depreciates very quickly, right? And typical policy announcements are one-time events, right? You say something and then stay silent for a long period of time. Our results suggest that, if we want to successfully move inflation expectations, it should be a sustained informational campaign. You should repeat message over and over and over again if you want to move inflation expectations. So repeat, repeat, repeat. Another one, which is very interesting, typically we have this intermediary link between policymakers and the general public, typically conventional media, right? So they should do the translation from complicated language to something accessible to the general public. We did two things. Again, ask people to read the FOMC statement, and then ask people to read basically the same message, but in the words of USA Today. And what we found here was that USA Today treatment is only half as effective as a FOMC statement. Now, it may be, fake news, low credibility. It doesn't matter at this point. What's important is that we can't rely on conventional media to reach out to households. Maybe we should use, social media, advertising, something else. I don't know. We have to be more creative here. Now, this inattention is obviously a problem if we want to manage inflation expectations, but it can also create unique opportunities for us, because if people know so little about monetary policy, we can educate them in a particular way to our advantage. For example, we can differentiate messages across audiences. Hypothetically, suppose you have a currency block with North countries doing very well and South countries not doing very well. If you have just one tool, the nominal interest rate, to stabilize this block, and this interest rate applies uniformly across different countries, it would be really hard to resolve these regional imbalances. Now, if you have a tailored message for North, that is, you should decelerate, and a message for the South, that you should accelerate, you may be able to resolve some of the imbalances. It's not going to be a perfect solution, complete solution, but it will be a step in the right direction. And the reason why it will work is because people in the North and the South know so little about monetary policy. Relatedly, if say inflation is too low, instead of telling people what the past inflation was, you can tell them about inflation target, which is higher than the past inflation. Now, our evidence suggests that if you do this, you're going to raise inflation expectations, you're going to induce people to consume more, you're going to induce firms to invest more, you're going to generate more inflation. So that should work, right? So we can make this communication strategy much more precise, much sharper than, just a simple nominal interest rate. Now, in the end, our conclusion is that inflation expectations as a policy tool have a huge potential, right? It can help us move consumption and employment, investment. It can directly influence prices. It can give us a new degree of flexibility that we can't have with just, nominal interest rates. We can target our messages to specific areas, industries, various groups of population. Are we ready to use it? Our answer is not yet. As I told you, we need to do more research to iron out various details. But more importantly, we have to do a lot more investment in the infrastructure. The first is that we have to have much better service of inflation expectations if we want to use inflation expectations as a tool. And I told you this is expensive, but we can do it. And another one is that we have to have a lot more investment in new communication strategies. And as Larry Summers said, we can't afford another recession when monetary policy doesn't have any ammunition. We have to do it very soon. Now, in the end, I just would like to say that Ben Bernanke once said that QE works in practice, but we now should make it work in theory. Here we have the opposite situation. Inflation expectations work in theory. Now we need to make them work in practice. Thank you.
Oops. Okay, thank you very much. Thank you for having me. That inflation expectations matter for monetary policy, I think, is a completely uncontroversial statement in this audience. And that most of the people in this room measure them and follow them pretty closely is also, I think, something that I'm very happy to state without needing further evidence. What is a fact, though, is that when people talk about inflation expectations and measure them, usually they are referring to either the expectations that come from financial prices. I'm sure that tonight there will be at least one news report saying what happened to the break-even rate or the swap rate following Mario Draghi's speech earlier this morning. Or secondly, we look at the surveys of professional forecasters. There's a series of people who are economists or others and who follow relatively closely what goes on with central banking and the overall economy. What this paper does, though, when they say inflation expectations, in some way they should put survey inflation expectations, because what they note is that over the last 20 years, and especially over the last 10 years, there's been an enormous amount of academic research on a different form of expectations, which are the ones that arise from surveys of firms and households, and that those do not play as much of a role into the monetary policy process, and yet we have learned a lot about how they work, and that some of those lessons should perhaps be incorporated or at least discussed. And so what the paper does is, for the most part, survey what we have learned over the last 10 years about inflation expectations. And so let me give you my survey of their survey of the survey of inflation expectations. First, that survey inflation expectations are consistent with a phenomenon which the theoretical literature is called inattention. What we mean by that, we mean that first, many people are clueless. They really don't know what inflation is now, in the recent past, in the distant past, in the future. They seem to pay very little attention to it. Second, though, that they're not clueless and stupid. That would be a very wrong, because they exhibit a lot of smart and rational behavior in other perspectives. First, they disagree not just about the future, as consistent with, say, just uncertainty, but also about the present. It's not just that we disagree on who's going to win the World Cup. If I serve you, we disagree also on what was the score of England-Tunisia last night. Some people paid attention, some people did not. Third, that the information seems to diffuse in the population. Again, people aren't stupid. You just see that with long and variable lags, to use a common monetary policy statement, you do see people catching up. They do figure out when we have large regime changes, they are sometimes even quick to catch up, but that their past experiences linger in an important way. They're not arbitrary, but actually what you live through seems to matter. Third, that in response to news, people update. If you tell them, if they learn about inflation, they do update. And moreover, that in volatile environments, in environments of high and volatile inflation, then they can actually update very quickly. There's the usual quip about how taxi cab drivers in Argentina are often extremely good at telling you what inflation was just in the last week, let alone the last few months. Available data, either from people's shopping experiences or the media, affects expectations, again, revealing a lot of, if not Bayesian updating, at least reflection of what news are. And finally, though, that if you look at certainly the last 20 years, many people are unaware of who is Mario Draghi, what is the ECB, or what are its targets. But that is not to say that at the same time they're not anchored in their expectations. And again, the members of the ECB should not be depressed about this last bullet point, because most people also don't know who the president of the Supreme Court of Justice is in Europe or of the European Commission. And in many ways, that's fine. They have other better things to worry about. And the role of a policymaker is to let them focus on whatever they're productive on and not draw attention to itself. So the conclusion from this is that, an important conclusion is that it's not the inattention that we observe or the facts from the surveys. It's not just that people don't have enough information. It's not just that policymakers don't speak with enough credibility. It's not just that they're simply backward-looking or stupid in some ways. It's simply that there's a lot of inattention as described by this set of facts. Second result, I think, from the literature and that the authors emphasize, is that survey expectations can be measured, but it takes effort. We have done it for households for many decades. We have started only recently doing it for firms. It is important and where the effort, so it can be done. In terms of the effort first, it is very important in surveys not to mistake disagreement for uncertainty. People are uncertain about the future. They can disagree a lot about the present, but not about the future. In the academic world, if you want, an old tradition of, say, I'm going to look at disagreement as a proxy for uncertainty is now a sure way to get your paper rejected at a journal. We know very well that these are very different concepts. They move very differently when we measure them. They're different theoretically. Third, that the wording of inflation turns out not to be too relevant. Whether you ask people about the CPI, core CPI, general absolute level of prices, they give you very consistent and similar answers. You can take that as, for the people in this room who obsess about the difference between these ones, just as we obsessed in the beginning of the session, you can take that as a discouraging answer. On the other hand, you can say that no matter what you ask people, they're being very coherent about what they think about a vague concept of what is the relevant, say, unit of account for their measures. Fourth, the design of questions matters, especially the ranges. But again, we've made enormous progress on exactly designing questions and avoiding most psychological biases in survey design. The sampling matters, and that it matters a lot whether you ask people about individuals versus aggregates. But the conclusion is that while the ECB has to be involved because it does take effort to do this right, it is certainly worthwhile because we are getting consistent, coherent answers by people when we ask them. Third and related, they seem to be correlated with actual economic decisions. We observe, and again, the fact that has been documented both in the time series and the cross-section, is that if higher expected interest rates, higher expected inflation lead to higher willingness to spend, meaning that when people expect more inflation, consistent with them expecting, therefore, that the real interest rate will be lower, they do spend more. And survey after study has kept on finding this. As Yuriy noted, more recent work has shown that when we look at expectations of higher inflation by firms, sometimes they raise prices and wages, sometimes they lower hiring and investment. The facts are less solid insofar as we get different answers, but again, so is the theory less solid. It will depend on whether the high inflation was driven by demand or supply shocks, whether you want to raise or lower prices, raise or lower hiring and investment. The households, though, or the firms, are at least giving you very inconsistent answers. That is, these surveys are not just noise, they're not just opinions, like whoever you think won England, Tunisia, or is going to win the World Cup, but they're very informative for the choices that people are making in terms of their actual economic decisions. Fourth point that the authors make in their survey, that policy announcements have little effect on them. Now, this is harder. It's a very hard question to answer. Why? First, given the inattention that I told you that one is documented, at best, only some people are paying attention when you make a policy announcement, and that's okay. But still, you have to really target those people to see the effects of the policy announcements. Given the slow diffusion of information, you have to look this at a certain lower frequency. You can't just see whether a policy announcement affects people's expectations in the next week. You really have to look over a few months, quarters, if not even years. Third, given the correlation between speeches and actions, most speeches announce actions, disentangling what was the effect of changing the interest rate versus talking about the interest rate or announcing something is hard. And fourthly, the reverse causality makes the identification very hard because many speeches are in response to, indeed, changes in expectations and other events that make it hard. As a result, it is very hard to see whether policy announcements have little effect on them or large effect. So what does Yuriy and colleagues do? In some regards, they look at essentially plots of event studies, that is, around some announcements of policy, what did happen to the expectations. Some of their events are really announcements of QE, which makes the distinction between policy and announcements very difficult. So instead, I'm going to focus here on the announcement by the Fed of a 2% inflation target. On the left panel, you have on the red line what happened to expected inflation from financial markets, and on the right, the one from professional forecasters. And the paper concludes from looking at this that policy announcements have some effect on expectations. I find it a little bit hard to see, meaning if I try to abstract from where I drew the vertical line and draw it somewhere else, I find it a little bit hard to see that there was a big change following the announcement. But perhaps what they emphasize more is that when they look instead of households, they say we see very, very little. That is, we don't see much of a change, whereas we see it before. Now, again, the evidence here comes from plotting at these, and when I look at these pictures versus these pictures, I just don't see much of a difference. In neither, it turns out to be very hard to see whether there's much of an announcement. Moreover, the frequency here on the horizontal axis has to do with months, weeks, or in the case of the financial markets, days, because we can measure them. When you go to the households, you have to measure in quarters. That's usually where the data comes, or months. If you plot the two at the same frequency, that is, you look at the financial markets and the household inflation expectations, it is just very hard to see, I think, a difference between policy announcements not having an effect that's differential between professionals or financial markets. It's just a difficult problem because when you do the low frequency, it's just very hard to draw a line and see a big effect. It's very hard to know. Maybe they have a little effect on them. I just don't know from looking at higher frequencies. I do know, though, from other work that when I look at lower frequencies and I look at large policy regime changes, I do seem to see an effect. When I look at the Volcker disinflation, and I plot for you from the Michigan survey the distribution of inflation expectations, what I see is that starting in '79, there was the nice bell-shaped curve around a high level of inflation. And when I play the picture forward all the way to 1982, where we then end up again with a nice bell-shaped line, bell-shaped curve around low inflation, I see that in between you see precisely the low and slow dissemination of information, a bimodality arising in the distribution of expectations, consistent with the change in policy regime having had an effect. Likewise, when one looks at the announcement of inflation targeting and looks in this picture at the spread of opinions among professionals, unfortunately we don't have evidence for this on households, and then compares non-inflation targets to inflation targeters, we see that inflation target, if nothing else, really shrinks the amount of disagreement that there exists in a very, very significant way. And likewise, when one compares inflation targeting adopted versus not, the solid line versus the dashed line, and looks at to what extent people make forecast errors that persist, one sees that within inflation targeters, when there's an inflation targeting regime, we see that forecasters are making much less serially correlated forecast errors, consistent with a lot more anchoring, and therefore this mattering. So policy announcements where it's a disinflation, inflation targeting, does seem to, in many ways, I think, be effective and communicated to the survey respondents. Fifth, the authors note, better communication can break inattention. Here's the evidence that one can bring to that. First, that if I tell you past or target inflation, that changes your expectation. This should not be very surprising. If I ask you, what's your inflation expectation now? Or maybe I shouldn't ask you that. I should ask you a different question. What's the population of Portugal right now? You will tell me a number, maybe 15 million. And then I'll say, actually, it's 20 million, or actually, it's 10 million. No matter which one I say, if I told you 10, I'd be surprised if after I ask you, what is your revised expectation population of Portugal, if I told you 10, you would say, well, then maybe 12 and a half, actually. Or if I told you 20, 17 and a half. If you tell people, they will update in that certain direction. Secondly, that once you tell them what inflation was, if you then add FOMC statements or news reports, that adds very little. Again, but that's consistent with the fact that the lag inflation is a pretty good lag or target inflation are pretty good predictors of what inflation is. The FOMC adds a little bit at the decimals to a point that people may not find that extremely relevant. And third, that if I reveal information to you again in a survey, I just told you the population of Portugal turns out to be a little shy of 10 million, that most likely in 6 months you're going to forget about that because lots of other things will have happened and Portugal's population is not the most important thing for you. And as a result, in 6 months, I ask you again and again, you tell me 15 million, even though it's a little shy of 10 million. Now, from these three pieces of evidence, the authors conclude that one should target message to the scenario, simple messages do better, repeat the message, and take the message directly to the target evidence. All of these are very sensible. I agree with all of them. But the three pieces of evidence that I reported, I don't think really support these as being very solid conclusions, as opposed to, again, very sensible things that are consistent with some of the evidence. Maybe, absolutely, I think we should target messages, have simple messages, repeat them. But do I have evidence that any of these really lead to better communication? I just don't think I have the evidence right now to support that. So, on the paper, yes, inattention, yes, we can measure them, yes, they're correlated. The policy announcements have little effect on them. At the high frequency, yes. At the low frequency, I think no. Subject to, though, a lot of uncertainty. And does better communication break inattention, I think, is an open question as of now. Now, aside from what is in the paper, or from this main point of the paper, the authors also go after this provocative question in the title, as Peter said in the introduction. Let me extend it to its justice. And the question is, are household or firms survey, and important to add the contribution here, it's the household and firm survey, not just inflation expectations, are they a policy tool? Now, so let me try to give you, in my remaining couple of minutes, my answer to this question. There's a pedantic answer, which is either A, of course, they're not a tool, they're an endogenous object, they're not something that you set, or, of course, they are something that a policymaker cares about. If you have an inflation targeting regime, and even if inflation is at 2%, you observe that households and firms all expect inflation to be accelerating to 5, 10, or 20% in a very consistent way, you better be worried. And I know no central bank that wouldn't be worried. So for sure, they are an intermediate target in the language of what central bankers often use. What I think is the more concrete question is rather, if we look at a precise exogenous tool, speeches by the members of the Governing Council, and one looks at their effect by measuring, like Yuriy said, using the surveys that we now have developed and which are coherent and well done, and one considers that one has to control to understand the effect of the speeches, one has to control, that is, have this being independent of other policies, interest rate, QE, or other policies. And finally, noting the transmissions from expected to actual inflation, where we care ultimately with inflation, what we really want to know is whether Mario Draghi's speech this morning, C, had an effect on inflation, ultimately the target. And that's going to be a result of understanding, A, the effect of expectations on actual inflation. That's what a lot of modern macro is. But importantly for the question that the authors ask, to what extent the speeches affect expected inflation conditional on not other policy actions? The real question is on what this second object is. And this is where I think the effort, or the more, if you want, precise way of stating the question in the previous slide, is to be made. That is, to what extent can speeches affect expectations, controlling for other policies? An immediate, or beyond answering that question, which certainly a priority for research, comes the fact that even if we find that it does affect, and I've already told you about the difficulty in measuring it in the first place from the low frequency, from the identification and others, is this because the communication, the speech is telling us something about future policy, peace in the future? Is it because it's telling us about what inflation actually is? Or is it because it's just moving them independently? The first one would be just communicating what you will do. If what you'll do matters, if setting interest rate today matters, surely telling you how I'm going to set interest rate in a few months should matter as well. Secondly is, to the extent that the central bank has a long staff of people that study economics very deeply and the conditions, they better have some information, produce some information that may be relevant such that revealing it may make a difference. Whereas the third one is really about animal spirits, to what extent I can make people believe and therefore shape their expectations. Now, the evidence from looking at forward guidance and policy dates using, crucially, financial markets points to a lot of the speeches that Mario Draghi and his colleagues around the room make are a lot about revealing fundamental information and some about revealing future policy. When it comes to to the households and the firms, that's a much more open question, like you were saying, but I think a very first order one. When you speak and people listen, is it because you're telling them something about the economy, future policy, or not? What about spirits? And that, I think, is a dangerous, and so I wanted to mention, interpretation of the question in this paper. To what extent can I just announce inflation target to be 4% instead of 2%, and in doing so have inflation magically jump to 4%? Now, the evidence we have for hyperinflation says that absolutely not. When hyperinflation's run and I just come in and say, don't worry, inflation's going to be low, I'll take care of it, nothing happens. Hyperinflation continues. Only when I do fundamental policy changes that often involve fiscal and monetary coordination can I actually do something about it. Second, we fall into the danger of propaganda. To what extent? It is very dangerous, and certainly dealing with politicians, as many of you do, shows you the clear evidence of that, is to what extent is it that it's very tempting for a politician to say, look, if you just make a speech, everything will be solved and nothing will happen without you actually having to do anything about it. But again, outside of some situations where multiple equilibrium is a reality, and some of which involve central banks like financial crisis and runs, I think that's a very dangerous attitude to have, and one that very, very, very often fails, as we see through the blasting of propaganda towards us. There's two more issues. One, how far away, that is, when we talk about the speeches today at T affecting expected inflation, or we talk about expected inflation in the long horizon or short horizon. And two, are we learning about permanent versus transitory components of inflation, where in many ways we'd like to think about the permanent components. On those two, a little bit of evidence is that, from the paper, it is true that households' inflation expectations move a lot in response to gasoline prices and others. But of course, they move in response to those transitory price changes, and they also move transitorily in response to those price changes. So even though it matters a lot, those gasoline price changes, in the same way that central bankers have learned to, in many ways, ignore these changes and focusing more on core inflation guiding policy, also ignoring the inflation expectations responses to those may end up being important. When it comes to the transitory versus permanent, it's important to note that over the last 10 years, there's been an enormous success of anchoring inflation expectations. Inflation expectations have not moved much when we look at long-run permanent expectations, in spite of a lot of variability of inflation. It was very useful for the ECB and other central banks that people were inattentive, and so when inflation fell below 0 in 2009 and 10, that people didn't revise their inflation expectations, but kind of didn't pay attention and thought that inflation was still around 2, making it easier for the comeback to happen. Whereas when it comes to fine-tuning, what we see from vector autoregressions, here the response to inflation expectations to monetary policy shocks, is that indeed you have these very slow and delayed responses to the shocks. So what's my answer to the question, so what's my answer to the question of inflation expectations as a policy tool, again, in the awareness of the authors? First, that moving animal spirits is hard, and experience with big changes has shown that not often effective, whereas communicating fundamentals in future policy is essentially unavoidable. It is unavoidable that a central bank would not share the information it has with the public, being itself a public information. That houses and firms focus on the transitory, but the key is that the central banks must extract the signal on the permanent. And to do so, looking at More moments meaning second moments in distributions and who's paying attention and some others becomes important. Third, that inattention makes anchoring easier, but fine-tuning harder. Precisely because people are not paying attention, it's very hard to shift them in high frequency, but it's good in low frequency. But on that, and to finish, compare this. Let me try to finish with an analogy. Compare this with food labeling. More important than whether inflation is 1%, 3%, 0%, 3 or 4, for my personal well-being, is how many calories or sugars I ingest during this year, in terms of my happiness, my well-being, and my health in many ways, as opposed to plus 1 or 2% of inflation effect it has on my real wage or real investments. Now, if I went and asked the survey of very smart people, how many calories did you ingest yesterday at dinner, my guess is that I would find that most of you are clueless. 1, 2, there would be a lot of disagreement on how many calories or sugar you ingested yesterday. And moreover, if I asked you to forecast how much sugar or calories will be consumed by the Portuguese population over the next 12 months, then you'd be very uncertain, have very little clue, even though this has enormous implications for health policy. Now, ladies, you are very inattentive about something that's very important to you. Now, that does not mean that we do not invest enormous resources in telling people how bad it is to ingest too much sugars, that we not impose a very costly food labeling criteria in terms of how many calories are in different meals of different types. And these are not very important to anchor choices, and they do not have an effect on people's dieting choices in a low-frequency, important welfare way. At the same time, no one in the health field will tell you that we should fine-tune those messages so that people eat more calories in the winter and less in the summer, as they should, as is optimal to do. But that is not to say that because you would fail at doing so, thinking about anchoring low-frequency expectations, taking into account people in attention is not important. And central banks probably have a lot to learn from the way we've done these food campaigns, and something that's very important for people. So monetary policy, when it comes to the stable unit of account, I think using expectations has been a great success. As a stabilization policy is very hard and perhaps unachievable. Thank you.
Thank you. Floor is open. Questions?
Another question. So, as you both said, the Michigan expectations and consumer expectations are very much influenced by oil. And they are short-term expectation, 1-year horizon, right? It's not, or the horizon, I mean, it's not clear what the horizon is, but it is very 1 year, right? So
5 years.
But what you, 1 or 5 years, but I mean, it's very likely that, consumers would look at what goes in their pockets, and so they look at oil, which is a very big component of price volatility. So a suggestion to look at your rational inattention thing, why don't you do announcement with OPEC announcement and see whether they move? Because, you would separate the inattention story from the oil story. And I think that would be the obvious thing to try.
Yes, first of all, I would like to thank Ricardo for his discussion. It was very, very nice. Going back to Lucrezia's question, so in the Michigan Survey of Consumers, we have expectations at different horizons. And one of the striking results in this survey is that if you think inflation is going to be 5% next year, you think inflation is going to be 5% in 5 years from now. Right? So there is a very high correlation between short-term expectations and long-term inflation expectations. Now, we didn't do this OPEC experiment, but this would be something we can easily do. One thing I should mention briefly is that in 2014, when oil prices collapsed, you can see a massive decrease in inflation expectations. So people paid attention. Also, not in this paper, but in another project with Coibion, we looked at inflation expectations as a function of how much people spend on gasoline. And what we found was that the more you spend on gasoline, the more sensitive you become to changes in prices of gasoline or oil.
Can I add something? So Lucrezia, I mean, people have done this, and indeed, just because Yuriy didn't. Yuriy has a very nice paper with Olivier Coibion in 2012 doing this. The way you need to do it is, though, not look at announcements in an event-steady way because of the slow lags, but put it in a VAR as a shock. And so
you mean the oil announcements?
Exactly. Use oil announcements, for instance, the way Lutz Kilian has built these series, and see what happens to first and second moments of expectations. What you find is, I showed a picture of that from a more recent paper by Melozzi there, but essentially you find this very slow response with this disagreement that initially increases and then declines, consistent with, again, some people figuring out and others catching up slowly, so it takes a while. And this is from Michigan survey in a VAR with the shocks in the oil prices, just like I think you would do.
On the idea that central banks should embark on manipulation, my instincts react extremely negative. Extremely negative. But it's not only my instincts. You have shown that in some cases, prices didn't rise after such announcements. Italy, I think, was so cynically one could say after 6 months households have forgotten. But did they also, they have forgotten probably the message on which they reacted. Have they also forgotten that what they experienced is different from what they were thinking when they increased their purchases of goods? And my understanding is that you mentioned only in a side remark that reaching households, the people, so to say, central banks should use social media.
Sure.
And social media, I think, work only. Not the ECB or any central bank could use social media. It must be personalized. So should President Draghi produce Twitters like Trump? What can the key issue is for me is what can central banks win if they use this media and even for manipulating, and what is the risk for their credibility?
Quick answers of many questions in the room.
Yeah, so manipulation is a tricky word, I agree. It gives you a very negative connotation that, you trick people into doing something. I use manipulation in a statistical sense. There is no causation without manipulation. This was the meaning. I didn't want to say that the central bank should give false information to households or firms. Only truth. That's reaction number one. About communication, one of the messages we have in the paper is that central bankers should learn from the politicians. Trump speaks in very simple sentences to reach out a wide audience in the US, right? So we can do the same. We don't have to have complicated statements. It doesn't have to be personalized. But one example of how successful social media could be, Trump has tens of millions of subscribers to his Twitter account. I don't know the exact number for the ECB, but I assume it's a small fraction of what Trump has. So if we really want to move inflation expectations, you have to make a big investment in this. Now, in terms of credibility, again, if you tell people truth, I don't think you undermine your credibility. If you tell people my inflation target is 2%, you don't lie. You move inflation expectations. You just execute what you were mandated to do.
Yes. This is a question for Professor.
Names and information in general.
This is a question for Professor Gorodnichenko. I'm Xavier Vidal-Folk from El País, Spain. If manipulation expectations in this case is so nice and much better than accurate information, shouldn't central banks replace their communication directorates and information desks by manipulator teams? Would that be consistent with the democratic values of advanced economies? Thank you.
Very quick answer.
Okay, it's not for me to decide. There are other people in the room who should make this decision.
No. Okay. Oh, Mario wants.
Mario, okay.
It's a question or an answer.
I find it irresistible to just say a couple of words. First, I tend to agree with Otmar. You don't measure credibility of a central bank by the fact that it tells the truth. You measure it by the fact that it's able to achieve its target. So the communication, if the matter is to tell the truth, shouldn't be the central bank to communicate about inflation expectations, should be some statistical office. So it's not so much a central bank's task. Central bank makes policy based on the current available information and its reading of it. So it's different things, I think.
Yes, I agree. You know, statistical offices can report this information to the public, and public should know it. But the available evidence suggests that most people pay no attention to what is provided by statistical offices. And so, if we want to convince people that we're successful at meeting our inflation target and so on, I believe it's the job of the central bank to convey this information to the public. Also, I don't see an inconsistency between telling people what they should think about inflation and achieving an inflation target. Because if inflation is too low, our job is to generate more inflation. We look for means to do this. One way to do it is lower interest rates and communicate it to the public. That's one way to do it. Another way to do it is to engage in deeper, more substantive communication strategies to move their inflation expectations, and so they can react to these policies as well.
Well, you see, that we don't agree much. So that's why, for example, we always refuse the idea of changing inflation target with a view to changing inflation expectations. So
I agree with you.
Either way, by the way. Thank you.
A bit disciplined here. So next question. There. No, here first. No, first. He was before, and then here. Just here. And then you.
Steve.
He's the guy.
Yeah. Thank you. I'm Philip Lowe from the Reserve Bank of Australia. I really enjoyed the presentation, so thank you. Our models are really clear here. If you change inflation expectations, you change inflation. And that's really an important part of our intellectual heritage that we carry. When we're talking about big changes in regime, that's obviously really important, shifting inflation expectations. But I really wonder, in the world that we're living in now with inflation between 1% and 3% in most countries, whether we can get much more from shifting inflation expectations. And I say that because when most firms are setting prices, the aggregate rate of inflation is way, way down the list of things they're worrying about. They're worrying about competition, their costs, the market power they have. Most firms don't even know what the current rate of inflation is. If they can get it within 1 or 2 percentage points, they're doing well. And the same is true at consumer level. If you're telling consumers inflation is going to be 2.5 rather than 2 or 1.5, really, do we think that changes their behaviour? I wouldn't even know how to adjust my optimal spending plan if someone shifted the rate of inflation by 0.5%. So that doesn't mean we shouldn't try and educate people, because I think we should do that. But to think that we can get a really big policy bang by manipulating or kind of engaging in some type of greater communication, I'm really very sceptical. There's one area, though, that I think we can make progress, and I've been trying this in Australia, and that's by trying to influence wage expectations. Because the aggregate rate of inflation, both past and expected, is often the critical variable into wage discussions, either if it's centralised or sometimes at the kind of the bilateral level. People really focus on what the current rate of inflation is there. So I think that you can influence inflation outcomes through influencing wage expectations, and that's a better way of going about it. At the moment, I've got a public campaign to try and lift wage expectations in Australia in the hope that we'll hit our inflation target. So I think it's wage expectations that are really the key variable here, rather than trying to manipulate inflation expectations. Thank you.
Let's take the next one, and then we'll see the answers. Yeah.
Okay, so I'm Erica Grosh from Cornell, and one of the things that I think is we forget is, remember, before inflation targeting, when people talked about what was success for a central bank was, well, price stability is when inflation is low enough that people don't take it into account in their decisions. So this inattention, one way to turn this around is, this is a sign of the success of central banking so far. And also, that very similar to what Philip just said, that is it really optimal for the central bank to be spending a lot of resources on trying to form expectations about something that really won't make that much difference in the quality of their lives, that really doesn't need to be factored in to their decisions so much. So I take the results as I'm not sure that it really works very well as a tool when you're talking about very low changes, small changes in inflation. Maybe in a regime where you get where you're talking about bigger changes in inflation, then it would seem to be a much more useful tool. But when you're talking about 0.5%, it's not clear you're going to get anything. Maybe at this point you just declare success.
No, thanks. Let me pick up a few other. I see Benoit, and then here also. Yeah. Here, and then very quickly. So I think I love to say something, by the way.
Yeah, it's Benoit Correa, ECB. So it's a very short remark, which is very consistent with what was just said, which is, I mean, when we teach macro and students ask us what's price stability, the easiest answer is just to say price stability is when people don't care about inflation, right? They don't care about changes in prices. So what is called inattention bias may just be a proof of success.
Thank you. Benoit? One question here. Maybe we pause in a second and I take another batch of questions.
That was the most interesting paper. I really enjoyed the facts that you brought to light. So one of them was that New Zealand is very different from Italy in the impact of inflation expectations on the real economy. Now, I have a theory about that, which I've been propounding for a long time, which has to do with households. So New Zealand is a very high debt economy. Households are heavily in debt. Inflation expectations, higher inflation expectations actually improve their expenditure, their ability to spend, because it reduces real debt. In Italy, Japan, Germany, you have households who've accumulated very large levels of liquid assets, have relatively low levels of debt relative to their liquid assets. High inflation reduces the value of those liquid assets and means they spend less. So the weight of savers relative to borrowers is the key thing here. So I think we really need to think very carefully about differences between countries and the way that policy works.
Thank you. Maybe, yeah.
Yeah, I would like to respond. So there is a question. We move inflation expectations by 50 basis points. Is it going to be effective or not? I find this discussion a little puzzling. If we take that moving nominal interest rates by 50 basis points is going to have any effect on the economy, we must reach the same conclusions about inflation expectations, because what matters is the real interest rate. You move nominal interest rate I, or you move inflation expectations. So if we all organize about moving nominal interest rates by 50 basis points and we expect to have some effect on the real economy, we should see exactly the same symmetrical effect when we move inflation expectations.
The point was mentioned on wage behavior, which I think is a very important point. In countries with indexation of wages, you know, people are very well aware about the indexed part. Now they don't necessarily believe in the inflation which is in the index, but at least they are very attentive to that. Did you try to spot differences between these countries and others? And then I take there is one question there.
So
yes, there. But maybe you answer.
Yeah, I'll answer very quickly. We didn't do this in New Zealand or in Italy, but in other countries, for example, in Uruguay, there is a formal process to renegotiate wages, and this is tied to inflation. And what we see is whenever firms, they renegotiate their labor contracts in different periods of time, when they have to renegotiate, they pay a lot more attention to inflation. If you're not at the stage when you renegotiate your contracts, you basically don't care. Yeah.
Question there.
Hello, I'm Mathieu from Stanford. So I think your work is not only relevant for inflation expectation, but also for household knowing real inflation and target of the central bank, because these have a broader effect, not only on the Euler equation, but also for political outcome and for people perception of the central bank. So if people knew how the inflation is and how was the target and why the central bank makes some policies, this can affect some political outcome and can affect people's perception of the central bank, which is very relevant for the current Yuriy situation in which we have different elections. So I think that I'm just asking if you're thinking about broader implication of your work.
Absolutely. You know, one thing I didn't want to mention about credibility is that in the US we have the survey about perceptions of the inflation target, right? And most people have no idea about the target of the Fed. So I interpret this as a low degree of credibility. And we view this paper as a suggestion that we should invest a lot more resources and energy in making sure that people know about the inflation target, the central bank has more credibility. You have to penetrate through this wall of inattention to show that, you know, we have successful central banks. They should be trusted instead of thinking that, you know, kill the Fed, stop the Fed, ECB is a bad institution, this kind of sense. So I agree with you. There are huge political implications, but our view is that, you know, having stronger communication strategy should help you, not hurt you.
Question on the left there. Luc? Yeah, Luc Laven, ECB. So several panelists said that households have very short memories, but there's some great work by Ulrike Momentier and a couple others looking at the Great Depression, the Depression babies, that people living through those periods actually are scarred for life. So they do carry that kind of memory with them. And so of course this focuses on some more structural components of inflation expectations, but they may be very important. And made me kind of think about the following. So let's say that central banks are very successful in reaching their targets. So inflation hovers around 2% in the aggregate. But in the Michigan survey, we see some stubborn behavior on the part of many of these households, and they keep reporting 4% all over. So the question for Yuriy, maybe Ricardo wants to jump in, is should central banks really care about that difference?
I think maybe the last one is Charles. No other questions, Charles. Then we will conclude.
Charles Wiplows, the Graduate Institute in Geneva. Yuriy's data, if I remember well, showed that when inflation is low, people tend to overestimate inflation, to think it's much higher than what we measure. And what it means, I think, to me, is that a large number of people just disbelieve the numbers, and they easily accuse whoever produced the numbers of manipulating to making them seem lower. Now, Jim's presentation was highly disquieting this morning because one way of listening to him is that these numbers are not really worth a lot. So it's another dimensions of things that we need to worry about, to try to reassure people or convince people that the numbers are at least honestly produced, but acknowledge at the same time that with a large standard error, whatever we mean inflation.
I have a very quick reaction about why we should care about expectations of consumers. First, these guys account for 60–70% of GDP in advanced economies, right? They have to be important. We have to understand what those people think. That's one. On a more practical level, if we care about, for example, the Phillips curve and we want to stabilize the economy around some inflation number, right? So then there is always a question whose expectations we should put in the Phillips curve. And available evidence suggests that if you put professional forecasters or something backward looking, the Phillips curve is dead. But if you use expectations of households or firms, you have a lot better kind of understanding between the relationship between inflation and slack in the economy. So it may have a very practical implication for policy.
Well, yes, well, a few minutes more. Lucrezia and Ricardo.
Yeah, I just wanted to try to bridge the gap between our session and your session following Charles. I mean, I think that the message this morning was not that we shouldn't care about headline inflation. The message is that mostly it's trend. The cyclical component is very small. I mean, that's your finding. It is my finding. It's a lot of other people's finding. So, and for inflation expectation, then the question is if Michigan reflects just this very transient oil cycle, then central bankers shouldn't care. But if it is actually an idiosyncratic trend, something that persists for a long time, then maybe we should care. So that's the evidence you should provide, I think.
Okay, so maybe you should correct me. I was under the impression that oil prices are random walks. They're not transitory. It's true there is a lot of noise.
No, I agree with you. Because, I agree with you, but you were not that clear on that in the sense that there is a component which, I mean, in terms of our Phillips curve models, oil price should go through marginal cost, okay? But then what your evidence is that there is another component of oil which goes, is probably linked to expectation, something else, and this is what makes the disanchoring. Now, is this transient or it is like a permanent component? I mean, so that's, and what's the quantitative importance of these two elements?
Just very briefly, because Luke asked, I mean, it goes back to the 2 points, my first 2 points in the summary. First, people are very inattentive, and I said experiences linger. I had exactly in mind Malmendier Nagel when I said that. There's an enormous amount of inattention, meaning if I was able to change your inflation expectations in a permanent way, along the lines of what Lucrezia was saying, then it really persists for a very long time. The transitory side was different, was what Yuriy was saying, is that though, if I just go and tell you something, if that just changes your expectations transitorily, that dies away very quickly. And so both facts are consistent with each other. They're not contradictory with each other. And why should we care? I mean, ultimately, that goes to then the second bullet point in my discussion of this work, which is that we keep on finding that these expectations matter for their choices. If they matter for their choices, they're going to matter for the macroeconomy. And so one has to care.
Thank you. My own experience with households is not too good in general. When I travel, I ask about inflation, and people have no clue, or they complain a lot about the loss of purchasing power in general. And in most countries where I go, I ask questions. Taxi drivers, of course, that's the worst of all. But even beyond that, and so now the way it works usually. It's market extremely. So you have two groups there. You have markets and they have households. And the markets are extremely sensitive. So financial conditions will react very quickly. And that will, of course, have an impact on the behavior in general. I think the indexation story is quite interesting. People don't believe the figures usually when you ask them, not the unions perhaps, but the public in general. They like it because they take it. I mean, what is given is given. But they don't believe the figures anyway.
Peter, you should remember that taxi drivers may be in the government.
Sorry?
Taxi drivers may be in the government.
Yeah. No, I mean, I mentioned it on purpose. I mean, it's an information. But okay, I think that has been quite fascinating discussion. But still, the impact of changing in expectations via the financial market, because that's usually the way it works. Now, the real expected rate, that remains, the difficult part, of course. Okay, thank you very much. I thought it was a very fascinating discussion. Thank you. And we have the panel just after.